Listen for a moment to the way the land breathes, because the story of the Hittites begins in the contours of Anatolia itself, a plateau stitched together by rivers and ringed by mountains. These highlands make sense of their rise, offering strategic heights, fertile valleys, and a crossroads between east and west. Imagine driving along a road that cuts through stepped farmland and then sudden cliffs. Here the Hittites first learned how to turn geography into power. Their story is not just about kings and battles, but about how people used the land to build an empire. Listen to the land the way the Hittites once did. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what moves you more, the power they built from the mountains or the empire that grew from the valleys. At the center of that rise was a place called Hattusa, a city that planted itself like a crown upon a hill. The city was more than stone and streets. It was a living library, a seat of law, a court of justice, and a workshop for diplomacy. From its gates carved with the images of gods to its inner rooms full of clay tablets, Hattusa radiated authority. When you picture an ancient capital, imagine these layered functions, all humming together under one skyline. The earliest Hittite kings carried names that still sound like echoes from a long tunnel of time: Hattusili, Mursili, Suppiluliuma. They did not appear from nowhere. Their rise was a slow accretion of marriages, treaties, and raids which became organized conquest. A chief here, a coalition there, and then a decisive victory that remade alliances into provinces. Over generations, local strongmen were transformed into imperial administrators who could mobilize chariots and grain alike. One of the great acts in Hittite memory was the march that toppled an old Mesopotamian center, the sack of Babylon. It was not merely the taking of a city, but a statement that the Hittites could reach into the heartland of older civilizations. The reach of Hittite arms surprised many contemporaries, because Anatolia had been thought remote, a place of mountains rather than diplomacy. Yet the Hittites proved that mountain kingdoms could speak the language of empire with equal force. The architecture of Hattusa told a story of defense and display at once, with massive stone walls and narrow gates that funneled visitors. These walls were punctuated by towers and flanked by monumental gateways where reliefs would hold festival and threat in the same image. Inside those walls were temples and palaces, craft workshops, and the rooms of scribes where clay tablets were pressed into permanent memory. The city was an orchestra of functions, each sound contributing to the music of statecraft. Scribes were the keepers of another Hittite power, the power of record. With clay, styluses, and cuneiform signs borrowed from Mesopotamia, they recorded treaties, myths, legal decrees, and daily accounts. Their archive would later become the modern scholar's window into Hittite life, a mosaic assembled from administrative notes and imperial letters. Each tablet carries a human voice, and when read in sequence they reconstruct conversations across centuries. The Hittite language itself became a startling revelation in modern times. When scholars finally deciphered those tablets, they discovered that the Hittites spoke an Indo-European tongue. This reshaped ideas about the spread of languages and peoples thousands of years ago. The realization that Anatolia had produced one of the earliest written witnesses to an Indo-European language made the Hittites pivotal in linguistic history, not merely political history. Religious life fed the center of Hittite identity, and their gods were vivid characters in an ongoing drama. Chief among them was the storm god, a deity of thunder and rain who held sway over weather, battle, and kingship. Alongside the storm stood the sun goddess of Arena, whose warmth sanctified kings and treaties alike. Rituals, sacrifices, and public festivals made divinity a visible force, woven into law and diplomacy so that the sacred and the political became indistinguishable. The Hittites were also inheritors and adapters of older mythic traditions. They borrowed tales and then rewrote them into uniquely Anatolian textures. In the myths, gods argued, tricked each other, and fought monstrous serpents, creating narratives that explained cosmic order and justified human actions. These mythic stories were recopied by scribes and paraded in royal courts, where they were used to educate princes and to remind rulers of the patterns of fate and power. In the world of the Hittites, law was a living thing, practical and scenario-based. Legal texts reveal an attention to family disputes, property, debt, and violence, but also to compensatory justice and ritual solutions. Rather than laying down abstract principles, Hittite law often presented specific cases, showing both the problem and the prescribed remedy. This pragmatic approach made law an instrument of social cohesion and royal authority. Daily life in Hittite lands ranged from the palace banquet to the peasant field, and both ends of society left traces that speak across millennia. Farmers tilled barley and wheat, shepherds moved flocks across seasonal pastures, and artisans hammered bronze into tools and weapons. Cities hosted markets where goods from distant lands could be bartered, Anatolian copper for Levantine cedar, or Syrian lapis for Mediterranean olive oil. That trade sustained the empire and connected it to a wider ancient economy. Metallurgy in particular was a realm in which the Hittites excelled and experimented, refining bronze alloys and mastering the art of the chariot. Metalworkers shaped the instruments of war and the ornaments of ceremony, creating objects that were beautiful and brutally effective. The famous Hittite mastery of metal introduced technologies that gave their armies mobility and reaching power. Even the early experiments with iron, whether mythic or practical, later generations associated with Anatolian skill. Hittite armies were organized around chariots and infantry, a combination that allowed them to maneuver quickly and strike with precision. Chariots were not merely vehicles but platforms for archers, combining speed and the deadly accuracy of composite bows. Commanders orchestrated these forces in plains and passes, understanding how terrain could transform advantage into disaster. When facing foes with different tactics, Hittite generals adapted, learning the hard lessons of coalition warfare. Diplomacy was as much a tool as the spear. The Hittites engaged in treaties, marriages, and diplomatic correspondence with neighbors as great and diverse as Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, and the city-states of Syria. The art of negotiation was recorded on tablets, sealed with the names of gods invoked to witness the agreement. Those treaties could stabilize borders, secure trade routes, and create alliances that underpinned imperial power. They also made the Hittites masters of ceremonial reciprocity. One of the most famous diplomatic documents from this age is the treaty that followed the Great Battle at Kadesh, where a Hittite force under Muwatalli II clashed with the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. The battlefield became the forge of diplomacy, since neither side could claim unequivocal victory and both needed a durable peace. Years later, a formal treaty was concluded that bound the two empires in mutual non-aggression and mutual aid. Inscribed copies of this agreement were kept in both capitals, a precedent for international law. Women at the Hittite court could hold considerable influence, and queens were sometimes visible and politically active. A queen named Pujahipa, wife of Hattusili III, stands out for her diplomatic correspondence and religious reforms. She interceded with foreign rulers, managed temple affairs, and wrote letters that reveal a mind engaged with policy as much as piety. Such women remind us that royal power could be collaborative and that queens could be policymakers in their own right. Artifacts from Hittite sites reveal sensibilities that mixed grandeur with a certain rough practicality. Stone reliefs at sites like Yazilikiah show gods in procession, their figures carved with an economy of line that still conveys majesty. Pottery, bronze bowls, and carved seals suggest domestic tastes as well as ceremonial ones. The material culture was a testimony to the skill and aesthetic judgment of people who took pride in craft even while they waged war and ruled. Religion had sacred landscapes as well as temple rooms, and rock sanctuaries became places where gods were visibly present. Yazilikiah, in particular, with its sequence of carved deities along a canyon wall, feels like a theater of the gods. Priests and kings processed through these spaces, invoking mythic histories that linked the present to a sacred past. Such sanctuaries were not isolated retreats but destinations integrated into the rhythms of public life. The Hittites also made a point of codifying their relationship to neighboring cultures, sometimes adopting foreign deities and rituals into their pantheon. This inclusiveness was pragmatic and symbolic, affirming the empire's sovereignty over a mosaic of peoples. By allowing local cults to persist under royal patronage, the Hittites managed diversity without uniformity. Religion became not only a matter of belief but a lever of administration. When the Hittite state reached its apogee, its bureaucracy grew to match the tasks of ruling a wide territory, collecting taxes, provisioning armies, and adjudicating disputes. Royal scribes tracked shipments of grain and metal, recorded births and deaths in the royal household, and drafted legal resolutions. This paperwork may seem mundane, yet it was the scaffolding on which imperial power rested. The ability to record and to remember was itself a form of strength. Scribes learned their skills in a culture that valued literacy for specific civic purposes, not for universal education. Schools training scribes taught the signs and the genres of texts that were necessary for administration: letters, legal cases, treaties, and ritual instructions. Apprenticeship shaped a class of specialists whose expertise made centralized governance possible. Without them, the Hittite imperial project would have been a palace without memory. Language in those archives reveals not only the Hittite tongue but also a polyglot world where Hurrian, Akkadian, and Luwian voices mingled. Akkadian served as an international diplomatic language for a time, and Hurrian influences appear in religious texts. Luwian, a closely related Anatolian language, shows up in monumental inscriptions carved in hieroglyphic signs distinct from cuneiform. This linguistic tapestry reflects centuries of exchange and overlap. In the courts of Hattusa, rulers wore regalia that announced their power, but legitimacy was drawn from divine sanction as much as military triumph. Coronation rituals placed the king within a lineage of gods and ancestors, consecrating his right to rule. Royal proclamations were often framed as fulfillment of divine wills, and the king himself acted as mediator between people and gods. Power was ceremonial and practical at once, shaped by myth and by the exigencies of governance. Beyond capitals and palaces, provincial centers across Anatolia echoed the patterns of central rule but retained local colors. Governors appointed by the king oversaw taxation and defense, yet local elites continued to exercise influence in their towns. These provincial rhythms knitted the empire to the countryside, translating imperial edicts into the language of everyday life. Roads, storehouses, and watchtowers linked center and periphery into a functioning system. Trade was the lifeblood of empires, and the Hittites were no exception, moving material and ideas along routes that connected the Aegean coast to Mesopotamia. Anatolia's mineral wealth, especially copper, made it a hub for metal exchange. Traders, caravans, and seafarers transmitted goods and culture, bringing foreign fashions, words, and gods back to Hattusa. The economy was as much about connections as about local production. The arts of negotiation included gifts exchanged at royal courts, where impressive objects served as signs of respect and mutual obligation. Diplomatic letters often enclosed descriptions of these gifts, as if packaging both material exchange and rhetorical courtesy. Gifts created relationships that could be called upon in time of war or famine, a currency of trust as well as of wealth. A crafted bowl or string of beads could seal a political relationship. City planning in Hittite urban centers combined functionality with symbolic statements of power, and Hattusa's layout was an explicit map of authority. Streets oriented to temples and palaces made movement itself an act of political choreography, guiding visitors from gates into spaces where power could be displayed. Water management, granaries, and storehouses ensured resilience against siege and drought. A well-managed city was a visible demonstration of the state's capacity to sustain life and legitimacy. Even the naming practices of rulers and gods offer a view into Hittite self-conception, with titles that emphasized divine favor or ancestral lineage. Kingship was often described in familial terms, rulers portrayed as fathers of the land. This language created expectations of paternal care and oversight that justified taxation and conscription as civic responsibilities. Royal narratives framed authority in human and cosmic terms. Military logistics impressed themselves into the administrative record, with lists of chariots, horses, and supplies setting the pace for campaigns. Marches required food, fodder, and maintenance for beasts of burden, and scribes tracked those needs in detail. Supply lines were lifelines, and the ability to provision an army determined success as much as tactics. War was thus a test of organization and endurance as much as of courage. Artists and craftsmen worked with a palette of materials that included stone, metal, wood, and clay, adapting each to local needs and ritual functions. Decorative motifs mixed local native designs with influences from Syria and the Aegean, creating an aesthetic that felt both Anatolian and cosmopolitan. Workshops might produce ritual paraphernalia for a temple and functional goods for a household in the same day, blurring sacred and secular production. Craftsmanship mattered for prestige and for everyday use. The Hittite world was also a theater for mythic dramas that taught rulers how to act, and their royal ideology borrowed from those stories to articulate virtues and vices. Tales of divine trials and victors underlined what a king should be: strong, clever, and favored by the gods. Myths served as blueprints for rulership, instructing and entertaining the elite who would govern the realm. Performance and narrative were political tools as well as spiritual nourishment. Climate and environment played roles in the Hittites' fortunes, because agriculture was sensitive to rainfall patterns and seasonal cycles. Periods of drought or crop failure could pressure the state's ability to pay soldiers and to feed cities. The Hittite response combined ritual supplication to the gods and practical measures like storage reserves and diversified agriculture. Understanding the natural world was both a religious duty and a political necessity. Hospitality and social exchange mattered in Hittite culture, shaping how strangers were received and how debts of honor were repaid. Feasts were social rituals that cemented alliances and displayed wealth, while hospitality laws regulated treatment of guests and travelers. These social codes kept movement between regions amicable and safeguarded networks of exchange. Personal relationships mattered to the functioning of the state as much as formal treaties did. Education for elites stressed practical knowledge for kings and administrators, blending religious training with records of precedent and law. Princes were schooled in diplomacy, ritual etiquette, and military leadership, expected to master both the pen and the spear. The curriculum balanced narrative tradition with technical skill, producing rulers who could read tablets and command armies. This combined education linked cultural memory with pragmatic governance. The Hittites did not exist in isolation from their neighbors, and the flows of people and ideas across borders created hybrid cultures, especially in borderlands like Syria. Here Hittite, Hurrian, and West Semitic customs fused into new practices that shaped art, religion, and law. These hybrid zones became laboratories of cultural creativity where imperial policies had to be flexible and locally attuned. The empire's strength came in part from its capacity to absorb and reconfigure diversity. Rituals of purification and oath-taking held legal weight, often forming the backbone of treaties and judicial decisions. To lie under an oath was to incur divine wrath as much as human punishment, so the sacred dimension of legal action made the court a moral theater. Kings presided over these oaths as both secular judges and sacred guarantors, their authority recognized by both priest and peasant. The intersection of piety and jurisprudence strengthened social order. Music and ceremony punctuated Hittite court life, filling palaces and temples with rhythms that synchronized courtly activity. Musicians played lyres and percussive instruments, and ritual songs preserved mythic language that connected humans to the divine. This musical culture made state events solemn and memorable, with sound as a vehicle for political meaning. Public spectacles reinforced hierarchy and narrative at once. Women beyond the royal court also participated in religious life, running temples, performing rites, and shaping local cultic practices. Priestesses could hold real authority in their communities, mediating between people and gods, and managing property attached to temples. Female religious leadership created alternative pathways to influence that ran alongside more visible political structures. The divine feminine had practical implications for social organization. The Hittites kept careful records of omens and divination, consulting liver readings, dream interpretations, and weather signs to anticipate events. Divination served decision-making in matters both martial and domestic, guiding kings on when to march and how to placate the gods. These practices were not mere superstition but embedded systems of meaning that helped people confront uncertainty. The ritual specialists who performed divination were a kind of early intelligence service, projecting information from the realm of signs into the realm of action. Fortifications were expressions of both fear and confidence, and the gates of Hattusa were statements of political identity that announced arrival to friend and foe alike. Lion and sphinx motifs carved into stone told visitors that they had entered a city under divine guardianship, while the thickness of walls spoke to the city's readiness to withstand siege. Gates served as stages for ceremonial arrivals and as choke points for defense, combining symbolism with practical architecture. A city's entrance was also an argument about who belonged and who did not. Law codes sometimes reveal compassion mingled with strictness, showing fines and compensations that aimed at restoring balance rather than merely punishing. Family disputes might focus on restitution, with penalties designed to repair social relations. This restorative bent preserved community cohesion and reduced cycles of revenge. Through such regulations, the law shaped a predictably ordered life where disputes could be solved without endless bloodshed. The material evidence of Hittite presence across Anatolia includes fortresses on hilltops, sanctuaries in valleys, and reliefs on rock faces that still stare across the centuries. Each archaeological trace is a thread leading back to a complex society that negotiated its place among older and contemporaneous cultures. Excavations have revealed the layout of palaces, the scripts of archive rooms, and the tools of daily life. These discoveries give texture to the historical narrative and remind us that ancient people left intentional marks for us to read. One cannot tell the Hittite story without mentioning their relationships with Assyria and Mitanni, powers that alternately threatened and allied with Hittite interests. The balance of power shifted across generations, as each empire waxed and waned with changing rulers, fortunes, and marriages. Assyria's rising mercantile and military power would ultimately put new pressures on Anatolian politics, while Mitanni's earlier dominance had defined a different set of challenges. The Hittites learned to navigate a diplomatic landscape that required both firmness and flexibility. Beyond power politics, the Hittite Empire nurtured a cosmopolitan culture in which ideas moved as freely as goods, with artisans and scribes borrowing motifs and expressions across borders. Artistic influences from Syria and the Aegean show up in ceramic forms and decorative themes, suggesting exchange networks that were cultural as well as economic. The Hittite elite liked to display exotic imports in palace spaces, turning foreign objects into markers of taste and reach. This blending of styles signaled a confident openness to the world. The written archive includes private letters that give surprisingly intimate glimpses into family life, concerns about childbirth, and the anxieties of everyday governance. These personal shards humanize rulers and administrators who otherwise loom as distant figures, revealing complaints, counsel, and affection. When a personal plea appears among royal decrees, it shows that the same scribal tools used for empire building were also used for intimate expression. The archive, in other words, preserves the human dimension of political life. Archaeological finds also include gaming pieces, musical instruments, and seal impressions that suggest how leisure and identity were intertwined. Games could simulate battle or strategy, while seals authenticated transactions and declarations. These objects remind us that people across ranks sought pleasure and identity through play and ornament, a world where leisure reinforced social ties and hierarchies. Such artifacts make ancient life feel immediate and inhabited. The Hittite collapse in the Late Bronze Age remains one of the most compelling and debated chapters in their history, a process that unfolded across decades rather than in a single catastrophe. Multiple causes have been proposed, including military defeats, internal rebellions, economic strain, climate change, and migration of peoples described later as sea peoples. Whatever the combination of factors, the central authority eroded and urban networks fractured, leading to the fragmentation of imperial control. After the collapse, fragments of Hittite culture persisted in smaller city-states and Neo-Hittite kingdoms that continued to speak local Anatolian languages and produce similar art. These successor states maintained aspects of Hittite royalty and religion, carving reliefs in the same stylized language across their city gates. This continuity shows that the empire's cultural imprint outlived its political cohesion. The memory of Hittite rule lived on in the built environment and in the political idioms of successor polities. Rediscovery of the Hittites in modern scholarship unfolded in the 19th and early 20th centuries as European explorers and archaeologists began to excavate the ruins of Hattusa and other sites. Clay tablets buried for millennia were brought to light and puzzles assembled into comprehensible scripts. A breakthrough came when a young Czech linguist deciphered the Hittite language as Indo-European, shifting our understanding of ancient linguistic geography. This modern recovery of the Hittites returned voices to silence and rearranged scholarly maps of the ancient world. The process of decipherment was itself a detective story. Scholars matched cuneiform signs to words and traced parallels to known languages, slowly resolving the grammar and vocabulary of a tongue separated by millennia. Each tablet yielded new puzzles, lists of gods, royal correspondence, treatises on ritual. The cumulative work of generations of philologists turned scattered inscriptions into a coherent historical narrative, demonstrating how patient scholarship can reconstruct lost worlds. Modern excavations have continued to expand what we know, unearthing entire archives of administrative tablets, temple inventories, and legal documents that illuminate the workings of the Hittite state. Archaeologists mapped street plans, reconstructed temples, and cataloged objects that once lay under floors. Scientific techniques like radiocarbon dating and isotopic analysis helped place findings into chronological and environmental context. The field has become interdisciplinary, blending textual studies, material science, and landscape archaeology to build a fuller picture. Museums across the world now preserve Hittite artifacts, which invite visitors to sense the reach of an ancient Anatolian civilization. Clay tablets, carved reliefs, and bronze objects are displayed with captions that try to translate an ancient world into modern experience. These museum pieces create a bridge across history and geography, letting us touch, in a mediated way, the techniques and aesthetics of people who lived 3,000 years ago. The presence of these objects in public spaces keeps Hittite memory alive. The Hittites' contribution to legal and diplomatic traditions resonates beyond their own era, showing how treaties and legal frameworks can stabilize relations between empires. Their treaties invoked shared obligations to gods and emphasized reciprocity, principles that would echo in later international relations. The ritualized practice of treaty-making demonstrates how ancient states created mechanisms for long-term cooperation, even across borders fraught with conflict. It is a reminder that ancient innovation in governance can have enduring relevance. Scholars continue to debate many aspects of Hittite history: the precise causes of decline, the dynamics of cultural assimilation, and the nuances of Hittite religion. New findings challenge old models and suggest more complex interactions between climate, economics, and political agency. Rather than a single narrative of rise and fall, the Hittite story emerges as a set of layered processes that changed over centuries. This open-endedness keeps the past lively and the field dynamic. The Hittites' interactions with the sea world also mattered, because coastal trade linked inland Anatolia with Cyprus, the Levant, and beyond. Maritime networks carried timber, olive oil, and luxury goods, and ports functioned as thresholds between inland producers and island or continental markets. Control of coastal nodes could amplify an inland state's power, and Hittite engagement with seafaring partners illustrates their capacity to project influence beyond their mountain strongholds. Those maritime connections made Anatolia part of a larger Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Religious syncretism in Hittite lands often produced hybrid cults in which foreign gods were integrated into local pantheons, sometimes changing names and attributes along the way. Such blending was practical, allowing conquered peoples to continue ancestral worship while also participating in the imperial cult. The process of syncretism slowed resistance and reshaped local identities without erasing their roots. Religion thus served as a flexible instrument of cultural accommodation. Linguistic studies continue to refine our understanding of Anatolian languages and their place in the Indo-European family, and Hittite remains a cornerstone of that research. Its early attestation provides essential data for reconstructing linguistic prehistory and migration patterns. Comparative linguistics uses Hittite to test hypotheses about how the ancestral Indo-European language split and spread. Thus, the Hittites inform not only history but also the deep story of human language. Beyond museum halls and academic books, the Hittites inspire modern artists, writers, and filmmakers who see in Anatolia a drama of myth, war, and epic architecture. Creative retellings reimagine royal courts and battlefield heroics, sometimes romanticizing, sometimes probing the ambiguities of ancient power. These cultural reinterpretations keep the Hittite narrative alive in public imagination, transforming archaeological data into stories that resonate with contemporary sensibilities. The legacy of the Hittites is visible in the place names and cultural memories of Anatolia itself, where ancient sanctuaries, rock faces, and ruins are woven into local tradition. Farmers and shepherds still work lands that bear traces of Hittite settlement, and some modern practices echo ancient rhythms of agriculture and ritual. This continuity of landscape provides a tangible connection between past and present, a reminder that history is embedded in places we still inhabit. Because the Hittites sat at a crossroads, their material culture includes goods of many origins that testify to the complexity of ancient trade. Bronze objects might be shaped from Anatolian ore, while the designs on a vessel could trace back to Syrian or Aegean workshops. Such hybrid objects are evidence of workshops attuned to wide markets and to tastes that transcended local boundaries. They point to an economy that was regionally integrated and cosmopolitan. The puzzle of how the Hittites administered such a vast realm invites reflection on the limits of pre-modern statecraft, because central power always had to be balanced against local autonomy. Governors wielded enough local authority to make policy stick, while the central court supplied legitimacy and oversight. This balance allowed the empire to expand without collapsing under its own weight, at least for a time, and it shows that ancient governance required sophistication rather than mere coercion. Hittite law sometimes dealt with personal injury in ways that privileged compensation over retribution, arranging fines that would be paid to victims or their families. This legal logic reduced social violence by providing predictable penalties and by formalizing the redress process. Where the state administered justice, it also absorbed the energy of private vengeance, channeling it back into civil order. Legal forms thus operated as a technology of peace. The spiritual imagination of the Hittites included visions of cosmic struggle where gods battled serpents and order was established through trial. These narratives were not just metaphysical speculation but models for earthly conflict resolution, instructing kings and warriors about courage and strategy. To perform a myth in court was to rehearse the conditions of kingship, and the dramatization of those stories made them tools for political education. Ritual theater taught the lessons of governance. Among the many kinds of texts, ritual manuals stand out for their precision and detail, prescribing gestures, offerings, and words to be used in temple rites. These manuals show an insistence on exactness as a means of securing divine favor, since ritual efficacy depended on performing the right rites in the right way. The standardization of ritual practice created a shared religious grammar across the empire, reinforcing cultural unity. Priests were guardians of orthopraxy as much as of belief. Architectural spaces were often imbued with symbolic meanings, with the orientation of temples, the placement of altars, and the procession routes all contributing to a sense of cosmic order. The built environment enacted theological claims, setting the stage for ceremonies that fused mundane politics with sacred mandates. The palace itself could be read as a theater where the king performed his role as divine intermediary. Such symbolism made architecture an active participant in religious life. The Hittite past continues to speak to scholars and listeners because it presents a model of imperial creativity, a society that blended military skill, diplomatic acumen, and cultural synthesis. Their achievements in law, literature, and statecraft are studies in how creativity and pragmatism can produce resilient polities. Listening to this history invites us to consider the art of governance and the human capacity to build complex institutions from modest beginnings. Even as empires fall and names fade from headlines, the Hittites remind us that cultural influence is a long game, layered across centuries and resurrected by later peoples. Their inscriptions, reliefs, and laws persisted in palimpsests of memory through successive cultures who inherited roads, rituals, and ruins. In that continued presence we see how civilizations leave legacies that outlive political forms. The traces in stone and clay are not just relics but active companions in the conversation across time. The Hittites may be gone, but their voice still echoes in the things we build and believe. Subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you feel their legacy more in the stories we tell or in the stones that still stand. When you travel through Anatolia today, you encounter a landscape that has absorbed and retained ancient stories in dirt tracks and ruined walls, and those inscriptions are a kind of voice. The echo of Hittite power survives in place names and in the contour of towns that grew up near ancient ruins. To walk these grounds is to move through strata of human effort where one civilization's work becomes another's foundation. The past remains with us in the earth's memory. The archive of clay tablets is more than a record, it is an invitation to think with ancient minds about law, ritual, and diplomacy, to feel how people once organized life and meaning. Reading a letter from a Hittite official, you can almost hear the cadence of worry and resolve, the mixture of administrative precision and human concern. Those voices bridge millennia, making the past accessible in the present through the simple act of reading what someone long ago took pains to write down. Archaeological conservation keeps those voices intelligible for future generations, using modern science to stabilize fragile tablets and conserve painted surfaces and carvings. Preservation extends the reach of history, ensuring that future listeners will hear the same archive we study today. The ethics of conservation thus become part of the Hittite story, a commitment to stewardship that links archaeologists and citizens across time. Protecting cultural heritage is a form of ongoing dialogue with the past. There is an artistic intimacy in the tactile traces left by Hittite hands, the thumbprint in clay, the hammer marks on bronze, the uneven stroke of a chisel marking a carved god. These small human traces collapse distance, reminding us that imperfect living hands shaped the artifacts we now analyze. In those marks we perceive not only technique but personality, the imprint of ordinary people mixed with the grandeur of kings. The human scale of production anchors the empire in everyday realities. Modern writers and storytellers often find in the Hittite world rich themes of political complexity, religious plurality, and cultural fusion, themes that resonate with contemporary concerns about identity and governance. Explorations of Hittite motifs in fiction invite modern readers to imagine the ethical dilemmas faced by rulers and priests, to dramatize the tensions between tradition and change. Storytelling thus extends the life of historical material, creating imaginative bridges that reanimate ancient conflicts and choices. The Hittites' interactions with the broader Near Eastern milieu created a diplomacy of exchange where gifts, hostages, and marriages sealed networks of alliance. These practices show the social underpinning of interstate politics. Kinship ties were diplomatic instruments, and royal marriages often cemented alliances more effectively than the sword. These practices underscore the social dimension of international relations, a reminder that human bonds shape geopolitical outcomes as much as military might does. Even the gods of the Hittites seem to reflect a multilingual, multicultural world, with names and attributes that travel and transform across borders. Deities are not static fixtures but actors who migrate, adapt, and acquire new roles in different contexts. This fluidity suggests a religious imagination that was inclusive and responsive to change, a religious diplomacy as flexible as its political counterpart. Gods became local and imperial at once, reflecting the human networks that worshipped them. When archaeologists reconstruct pottery styles, they trace not only aesthetic preferences but also trade routes and cultural connections, because patterns and clay compositions map onto flows of people and goods. A shard found in one valley can connect to a kiln in another region, forming a silent conversation across space about taste and exchange. Such detective work reveals the mundane but vital links that made ancient economies function. Pieces of pottery become clues to lost economic geographies. The Hittites were not static in their institutions. Over centuries, their bureaucracies, laws, and religious practices evolved in response to internal needs and external pressures. Reforms were made, rituals adjusted, and diplomatic vocabularies renewed as the state responded to changing circumstances. This willingness to adapt contributed to its longevity until a confluence of stresses overwhelmed the system. Understanding this dynamic process helps us see history as a series of responses rather than a straight line. Landscape archaeology has shown how settlement patterns changed across time, reflecting shifts in political centralization and agricultural strategies. When central authority waned, smaller, more fortified settlements proliferated as communities prioritized local defense. Conversely, when the state was strong, larger urban centers concentrated population and economic activity. These shifts illustrate the interplay between politics, security, and human settlement. There are moments in Hittite archives that feel startlingly modern, like the careful negotiation of prisoner exchanges, the accounting of food supplies, and the drafting of assurances to allies. Such bureaucratic details show an administrative sophistication that rivaled contemporary powers. The procedural language used in those tablets looks not unlike a modern office's record, emphasizing responsibilities and contingencies. In this way, the Hittites appear as ancient practitioners of what we might now call public administration. Critically, the study of the Hittites also teaches humility. The sources are incomplete, interpretations shift with new finds, and certainty is always provisional. Historians and archaeologists assemble the past from fragments, and each new shard can reshape our picture of the whole. This process keeps the past alive and contests simplistic narratives in favor of nuanced reconstructions. The Hittite story thus remains a field of ongoing discovery and debate. In contemporary Turkey and neighboring regions, Hittite heritage is an element of local identity and public history, integrated into museums, tourist trails, and educational programs. The material remains of the empire are tangible assets that communities use to shape historical memory and local pride. This living reception of ancient heritage bridges archaeology and public culture, making the ancient past part of present civic life. The Hittites remain relevant not only to scholars but to the people who live in their former lands. We can close this stretch of our journey not by ending the story but by opening a window onto the continuing work of research, conservation, and storytelling that keeps the Hittite past dynamically connected to the present. Their archives, temples, and ruins invite us to listen carefully, to read slowly, and to inhabit the perspectives of people who built and governed an empire on Anatolian hills. The Hittites remind us that power is complex, that culture is always hybrid, and that history is a conversation across time that we are all invited to join. In the dry hush before dawn, Hattusa rose from the Anatolian plain like a statement carved in stone, its towers and walls catching the first light as if to declare the arrival of a new order. The city was not just a place but a concept, a center of power whose name echoed through the valleys and across the mountains to the sea. In the age of kings and conquests, Hattusa became a crucible where ambition, ritual, and administration fused into a ruling machine that held a vast and varied realm together. The people who built and governed Hattusa were called Hittites by later scholars, but they named themselves in ways that shifted with dialect, dynasty, and the needs of rhetoric. They were heirs to older Anatolian traditions and innovators who adopted ideas from Mesopotamia and the Levant without losing their own edge. This cultural synthesis made them adept at navigating worlds of diplomacy and war, religion and law, trade and metallurgy, and it is this adaptability that defined their golden era. To understand Hattusa is to tour a city of contrasts, massive fortifications and delicate seal impressions, martial trophies and careful legal codes, temples overflowing with offerings and archives of bureaucratic detail. The city stood on a rocky outcrop ringed by double walls and gateways protected by towers, the whole defended by sheer sloping embankments that made it daunting to approaching enemies. Behind those defenses lay streets and courtyards, palaces and granaries, shrines and workshops, each space calibrated to sustain a kingdom perched on the edge of empires. The walls themselves were a message. Built in concentric belts, faced with stone and rising to impressive heights, they looked less like mere protection than like a theatrical performance of security and permanence. Gates were named and decorated with reliefs that warned and invited in equal measure, lions and scarabs carved into thresholds that had seen both triumphant processions and anxious councils. For a ruler, such fortifications were proof of control over people and landscape, convincing subjects and neighbors that Hattusa was a capital not only in name but in capacity. Rulers in Hattusa commanded respect through visible ritual as much as through sword and treaty. They received envoys in grand halls where carved beams and painted plaster traced cosmologies and genealogies, and where sacrifices punctuated political negotiation with the gravity of divine witness. Kings presented themselves as intermediaries between gods and mortals, offering gifts to gods and laws to subjects, a dual role that required both piety and pragmatism. The dynasty that made Hattusa famous was not a continuous line of unbroken power, but a succession of strong personalities who reshaped the kingdom as they rose. Names like Hattusili, Mursili, and Suppiluliuma recur like themes in a long composition, each king adjusting the rhythm and scope of Hittite influence. Hattusili I asserted early muscle, Mursili I reached far across Syria, and centuries later Suppiluliuma I revived expansion with an energy that startled both allies and rivals. Hattusili I, often remembered for founding royal traditions and consolidating territories, fashioned a model of kingship that combined military initiative with careful legal structuring. His campaigns secured lands and trade routes, but they also necessitated administrative systems capable of managing tribute, supply, and loyalty across varied terrains. That need pushed Hittite governance into sophisticated record-keeping and an attentiveness to local elites that would become a hallmark of their rule. Mursili I took the Hittite reach even farther, embarking on campaigns that shocked neighboring states by carrying the Hittite banner into Syria and beyond. His military ventures brought riches, foreign captives, and raw materials back to Hattusa, but they also established patterns of interaction, alliances, vassalage, reciprocal treaties that would define the kingdom's external relations for generations. Yet such outward pressures sometimes left internal fissures, which required legal mechanisms and ceremonial reaffirmations to mend. Over time, Hattusa became a hub where languages and scripts crossed paths. The Hittites used their own Anatolian tongue for internal matters, but for diplomacy they often employed Akkadian, the lingua franca of the Near East. This bilingual habit allowed them to participate in broader networks of correspondence, trade, and treaty negotiations, making their capital a center of both local identity and international conversation. The royal archives of Hattusa preserved an astonishing variety of documents, treaties, letters, legal cases, religious texts, mythic narratives, and administrative records. Clay tablets, inscribed with wedge-shaped characters and carefully stored in rooms of the palace, became a memory bank that kings and scribes consulted to legitimize decisions and to recall the precedents of law and custom. Those tablets now are our principal window into the inner life of a state that otherwise could only be reconstructed from ruins and fragments. Suppiluliuma I stands among the most magnetic of Hittite rulers, a strategist who turned Hattusa into a power that could match and challenge other great states of the time. His campaigns in Syria and against Mitanni reshaped alliances and carved out spheres of influence, while his diplomatic cunning turned the institution of marriage and treaty into instruments of imperial policy. In his hands, Hattusa was not merely a fortress but the focal point of a network of client kings, tribute, and negotiated peace. The Hittite military was a blend of light infantry, chariotry, and skilled archers, trained for speed and shock as much as for endurance. Chariots, in particular, were both symbols and tools of power, carrying nobles and archers into battle with speed and a height advantage that could turn an engagement. Training, logistics, and seasonal campaigning cycles mattered as much as tactics, and Hittite kings took pride in their ability to field and sustain forces across vast distances. Hattusa's economy rested on agriculture, herds, craft specialization, and trade. Farmers worked the surrounding plains and terraces, producing grain and livestock that supplied the city and its armies. Craftsmen in the workshops produced textiles, metalwork, and ceramics, and merchants moved goods like timber, tin, and luxury items along routes that linked Anatolia to Syria, the Aegean, and Mesopotamia. Metallurgy was a secret in plain sight, a combination of technical knowledge and resource networks that gave Hittite smiths an edge. Bronze required tin and copper, materials not always locally available, so long-distance trade was essential. Control of resources and mastery of alloying and casting techniques meant that weapons and tools could be produced to a high standard, and that Hattusa could offer material levels of reward to allies and retainers. The palace at Hattusa was a complex within a complex, a series of courtyards, administrative rooms, religious chapels, and private apartments that managed both the state's business and the king's life. Scribes worked in groups, copying and translating texts, issuing orders, and creating records that bound officials to their duties. Priests and ritual specialists occupied other spaces, conducting ceremonies that sustained the connection between city and cosmos. Religion in Hattusa was polytheistic, layered, and intensely local, with gods of mountain, storm, sun, and hearth placed within a Hittite cosmology that absorbed older Anatolian deities and new Syrian figures. The storm god held a place of honor, often associated with kingship and martial might, but myriad local gods retained power over particular regions and families. Rituals involved offerings, recitations, and sometimes elaborate processions that linked palace, temple, and town in daily practice. Temple architecture was designed to amplify both sound and symbol, with inner sanctuaries housing cult images and outer courts allowing congregation and sacrifice. Temples were not merely houses for gods, but active centers of economic life, holding land, receiving offerings, and directing labor. The collaboration between temple and palace created a shared space of authority that reinforced the king's religious claims with tangible wealth and resources. Law codes in Hattusa reflected a delicate balancing act between royal decree and customary practice. Kings issued edicts to settle disputes, regulate property, and define punishments, but they also relied on a corpus of precedents that gave the legal system continuity. Judges and local officials executed decisions that kept the social fabric intact, and through these processes the king maintained a reputation for justice and order. The Hittite legal mind was pragmatic. Rather than fixating on abstract principles, it addressed concrete conflicts, land boundaries, debt, inheritance, and oaths. Punishments could be severe but were often tempered by options for restitution, compensation, or oath-bound reconciliation. Sacred guarantees and divine sanctions underpinned these practices, making courtroom procedures as much about maintaining cosmic balance as about social stability. Diplomacy in Hattusa relied on skillful rhetoric and ritualized exchange. Envoys carried gifts and letters, and their appearances in court were choreographed to convey respect and strength. Treaties were sealed with veneer and oath, sometimes invoking gods as witnesses, and clauses would specify borders, marriages, and obligations in exacting detail. One of the most famous episodes of Hittite diplomacy and warfare unfolded at Kadesh, where Hittite and Egyptian ambitions collided in a contest that became legend. The battle itself was brutal and confused, a field of turning fortunes where chariot charges and command decisions mattered immensely. In its aftermath, both sides recognized that sustained warfare was costly and that a negotiated settlement, witnessed by deities and documented in written accords, could offer a more durable route to security. The treaty between Hattusa and Ramesses II is a landmark in diplomatic history, remarkable for its language of mutual guarantee and divine enforcement. It reads like a covenant between two great powers, a mutual recognition of spheres, and a commitment to assist against aggression. The document carries the tone of mutual respect and anxiety, a testament to the limits of conquest and the stabilizing force of law. Hutti's cultural life was rich with myth and storytelling, preserved in epics and rituals that linked the mortal realm to a universe of gods, monsters, and ancestral deeds. Stories explained the origin of kings, the behavior of natural forces, and the reasons for ritual practice, serving both entertainment and instruction. These narratives were performed in temple and palace, and they enriched the psychological landscape of the kingdom, reinforcing norms and inspiring loyalty. Art in Hattusa ranged from monumental reliefs to delicate seals and ivories, and it often carried the same dual purpose of status and belief. Sculptors and painters represented gods, animals, and royal personages with a mix of local motifs and borrowed styles, producing works that were both familiar and cosmopolitan. Decorative motifs, winged creatures, rosettes, geometric patterns, traveled across borders, signaling connections and aspirations. The royal household was a microcosm of Hittite politics, where advisors, relatives, and captains of different factions jostled for influence. Succession was not always smooth, creating episodes of conflict that could be resolved by war, marriage, or diplomacy. Kings needed counselors who understood the subtleties of court ritual, the pulse of the army, and the grain of provincial sentiment, and Hattusa's success depended on recruiting and managing such people. Women in Hittite society held roles that could be influential, though often overlooked in grand narratives of kingship. Elite women participated in diplomatic marriage strategies, served as priestesses, and sometimes managed estates. Queens were public figures who could sponsor temples and rituals, and on occasion they appear in legal texts as actors with property rights and familial responsibilities. Hattusa's artisans formed guild-like networks where knowledge passed from master to apprentice, ensuring continuity in production techniques. Textile workshops produced fabrics for both mundane and ceremonial uses, while carpenters and stonemasons built and repaired the city's infrastructure. The division of labor was not strictly modern in its categories, but it supported an economy that could mobilize resources for war, building, and ritual. Markets in the city were lively spaces where surplus goods circulated and news was traded alongside commodities. Barter and monetary transactions existed side by side, with precious metals and weighted measures used for larger deals. Merchants kept track of credit and reputation, and long-term trade relationships could involve reciprocal visits, treaties, and the exchange of hostages or marriage partners to secure trust. Beyond material goods, ideas and religious beliefs traveled along the same routes. Gods moved with merchants and soldiers, joining local pantheons, and foreign rituals were adopted and adapted in Hattusa's syncretic religious landscape. This openness made the city a place where the new could be fitted into the old without losing continuity, a flexible conservatism that allowed innovation within tradition. The Hittite legal and religious texts show a fascination with ritual precision, with specific words and gestures required to effect a desired outcome. Rituals were not mere formalities, they were viewed as mechanisms that could arrest angered gods, cure disease, and protect crops. Scribal manuals recorded the steps of rites, the materials needed, and the appropriate incantations, reflecting a bureaucratic respect for order in sacred matters. Education in Hattusa revolved around scribal training, where young boys, sometimes girls, learned to write in cuneiform and to play the role of professional intermediaries. Schools taught language, arithmetic, and ritual procedure, preparing students for careers in administration, temple service, or diplomacy. The ability to write and to recall legal and ritual precedents granted social mobility and influence within the kingdom's hierarchies. The landscape around Hattusa shaped its strategies and its vulnerabilities. Rivers fed fields and allowed travel, while mountain passes provided both defensive advantage and potential routes for invasion. Control of timber and stone dictated the pace of building projects, and access to grazing land determined the sustainability of herds that fed the city and its armies. Seasonal rhythms governed agricultural life and military campaigns alike. Planting and harvest dictated when armies could be raised without crippling the economy, and seasonal weather patterns required strategic planning for supply lines and siege operations. The king's calendar and the temple calendar intertwined, coordinating labor for public works and ensuring provisions for festivals and war alike. Fortifications around Hattusa included not only stone walls but also ditches, earthworks, and watch posts that extended the city's defensive reach into the countryside. These features formed a defensive landscape that forced attackers into calculated approaches, giving defenders time to mobilize in response. The very presence of extensive fortifications also had psychological effects, demonstrating to subject populations the state's permanence and preparedness. Hattusa's gates were more than entrances, they served as stages for ritual and statement. Each gate had a name and often bore iconography intended to deter enemies and to reassure citizens. Processions passed through these portals, and messages were publicly posted and proclaimed, turning gateways into instruments of communication as well as defense. The royal granaries and storehouses of Hattusa preserved wealth in grain, oil, and textiles, functioning as emergency reserves and as stocks for distribution to soldiers and officials. Control of these stores allowed the king to reward loyalty and to sustain prolonged campaigns without immediate dependence on outside supplies. Managing such resources required careful accounting and a dependable network of stewards and inspectors. Hattusa's archives reveal a bureaucracy that functioned with surprising sophistication for its time. Officials recorded rations, labor obligations, land grants, and legal resolutions, creating a paper trail that ensured continuity and accountability. The preservation of these documents was sometimes intentional, with clay tablets stored in libraries and temple rooms, the same rooms that modern archaeologists would one day uncover. The discovery of Hattusa in modern times is almost as dramatic as any ancient tale. Excavations began to peel back layers of silt and rubble, revealing gateways, palaces, and the very tablets that spoke across millennia. Archaeologists found not only architecture but a civilization's voice in clay, and these texts transformed scholarly understanding of the ancient Near East. Hugo Winkler and other early excavators read the signs and realized that these ruins corresponded to a people long suspected from fragmentary references in Assyrian and Egyptian sources. As more tablets were deciphered, a coherent picture of Hittite history began to emerge, along with surprises that challenged previous assumptions. The process of discovery was slow and painstaking, requiring patience, comparative linguistics, and a stubborn willingness to listen to what fragments had to say. Restoration efforts at Hattusa have aimed to stabilize structures and to make the site legible without erasing signs of time. Archaeologists and conservators balance preservation with public access, often debating how to present ruins in a way that honors both scholarship and experience. The site today is a place of pilgrimage for historians and curious travelers, where the stones still seem to whisper of councils and sacrifices long past. The Hittite repertoire of treaties and royal letters reveals a sophisticated understanding of statecraft. Kings made promises and negotiated terms with an eye toward long-term stability, often invoking divine enforceability to ensure compliance. These documents show that Hattusa's rulers understood the limits of coercion and the benefits of negotiated order. Hittite diplomacy often made use of marriage alliances to secure loyalty and to bind neighboring powers into webs of mutual interest. Royal daughters and wives could become instruments of policy, carrying names and claims across borders as living treaties. But marriage diplomacy carried risks, too, as foreign influence could create rival factions within the court or produce complex succession claims. Religion and politics intertwined deeply, with gods invoked to justify territorial claims and to ratify treaties. Kings placed offerings to deities on conquered lands and established cults to ensure divine favor. Rituals could serve as public spectacles that reaffirmed the king's role as protector and mediator, binding subjects to rulers through shared ceremony. Hattusa's scribal tradition preserved not only laws and treaties but also myths and rituals in meticulous detail, including accounts of storm gods, serpent deities, and cosmic battles. These narratives were retold within ritual contexts to reinforce social memory, to teach proper conduct, and to explain the divine order underlying earthly events. The interplay of myth and administration made Hattusa a place where belief and governance coexisted intimately. Hittite art and symbolism frequently repurposed animal imagery, lions, bulls, birds of prey, to express strength, divinity, and royal protection. Such motifs appeared on seals, reliefs, and ceremonial objects, articulating a visual vocabulary recognizable across the kingdom. Art was not purely decorative, it functioned as a language of power, instantly readable to those who understood its conventions. Trade routes that touched Hattusa brought exotic goods and likewise new ideas, from lapis lazuli and ivory to religious concepts and metallurgical techniques. Merchants negotiated not only prices but cultural exchange, and the capital's markets reflected this cosmopolitan traffic. Such commerce underpinned both urban consumption and broader geopolitical ambitions. The story of Hattusa's golden era is also a story of adaptation and vulnerability, of a state that could expand and stabilize yet remain sensitive to changing economic and climatic conditions. Agricultural shortfalls, disruptions in trade, and political fragmentation could upset carefully maintained systems. Kings therefore invested in administrative reforms, infrastructure, and diplomatic networks to mitigate such risks. Inevitably, the pressures of the Late Bronze Age left their mark on Hattusa. The complex web of alliances and conflicts across the Near East meant that shocks in one place could reverberate widely, affecting supplies, loyalties, and military readiness. Yet Hattusa's response was often to double down on record-keeping and legal clarity, building resilience into the kingdom's institutional memory. The role of local elites in outlying regions was crucial to Hattusa's stability. Governors and client kings managed day-to-day affairs while the central court negotiated larger policy. These local rulers could be powerful actors who sometimes challenged and other times supported the king's initiatives. Maintaining their loyalty required a mixture of concession, marriage ties, and military oversight. Hittite religion included rites of purification and healing that addressed both individual and communal health concerns, with rituals designed to expel illness and to restore social harmony. Priests and exorcists used incantations, figurines, and offerings to treat disease, and these practices were documented in precise procedural texts. Such attention to healing reflected a worldview in which the spiritual and the physical were deeply interwoven. Architecture in Hattusa displayed a palette of materials and techniques, from dressed stone facades to timber beams and mud brick walls. Decorative plaster and paint once enlivened interiors, and carved stone elements framed gates and sacred spaces. The surviving fragments allow us to imagine colors that have long since faded, and to sense the tactile richness of a city built to endure both ritual and siege. The Hittite calendar segmented the year into festivals, agricultural tasks, and administrative cycles, providing a rhythm that structured public life. Religious festivals could involve pilgrimages to mountaintop sanctuaries, communal sacrifice, and feasting that reinforced collective identity. These shared moments of ritual gave shape to the city's social cohesion, allowing the king to harness communal energy for public ends. Hattusa's hinterland contained smaller towns and fortresses that were integrated into the kingdom through roads and seasonal movement, creating a regional network that sustained the capital. These nodes served as grain collectors, garrison towns, and administrative centers, and their loyalty was essential to the functioning of the state. The relationship between center and periphery was negotiated continually through tax, tribute, and reciprocal obligations. The Hittite approach to succession and legitimacy was inherently performative, relying on public ceremonies, oaths, and sometimes divine confirmation to ratify rulership. Kingship required active maintenance through sacrificial calendars, public decrees, and the visible distribution of favors. The absence of a smooth hereditary rule sometimes opened space for ambitious nobles, but ritual and law provided mechanisms for resolving disputes. Children of elite families were educated in both practical and ceremonial matters, learning horsemanship, administration, and ritual performance as part of their upbringing. Boys and girls trained for roles that aligned with family status, and marriages served to consolidate wealth and influence across generations. This social reproduction sustained the networks of loyalty that made state governance possible. Hattusa's cultural footprint extended beyond its political control, influencing neighboring peoples through language, art, and trade practices. Local elites sometimes emulated Hittite court culture, adopting titles, rituals, and diplomatic formulas. This diffusion created a sphere of cultural gravitation that testified to Hattusa's prestige and administrative sophistication. The king's image was propagated through inscriptions, public works, and ritual performance, each medium reinforcing the narrative of rightful rule. Monumental inscriptions declared victories and deeds, while temples and palaces served as enduring reminders of royal beneficence and sacred favor. The carefully managed visibility of kingship helped to naturalize authority in the public imagination. Hattusa was also a city of craftsmen who specialized in complicated technologies like textile spinning, dyeing, and metal casting, producing goods that ranged from everyday pots to ceremonial costumes. Guilds and workshops passed down tacit knowledge, and certain families maintained reputations for skill that lasted generations. Their labor undergirded both domestic life and the state's capacity for ceremonial display and military provisioning. The Hittite judicial system balanced local custom with royal authority, allowing for mediation and reconciliation as practical solutions to social friction. Trials could be public affairs where oaths and witnesses played central roles, and sometimes ordeals were used to ascertain truth in contested cases. The balance of divine sanction and human arbitration made the system meaningful to both rulers and commoners. Seafaring connections to the Aegean and Mediterranean enriched Hattusa's material culture and opened avenues for exchange of ideas and styles. Even though Hattusa lay inland, its merchants and diplomats engaged with maritime powers, transporting goods across overland routes to coastal ports. These interactions brought foreign luxury items and artistic motifs to the capital, expanding its tastes and resources. The Hittites' language preserved in cuneiform tablets belongs to an Anatolian branch of languages that are part of the Indo-European family, a discovery that mattered greatly to linguists and historians. Understanding this linguistic affiliation helps scholars trace patterns of migration and cultural contact across Eurasia, altering long-held assumptions about who spoke what, where, and when. Language thus became another avenue through which Hattusa's story connected to a broader human narrative. The rituals of kingship often involved the storm god and other powerful deities, and some coronation rites included oaths and symbolic acts meant to align the ruler with cosmic forces. These acts were performed before assembled officials and priests, transforming personal authority into a public trust backed by divine obligation. The performative dimension of leadership made the king both a political actor and a living symbol of order. Hattusa's artisans also worked in precious materials like gold and silver, producing jewelry and decorative items that proclaimed elite status. Such items were not mere luxury, they functioned as portable wealth, used in diplomacy and as royal gifts to cement alliances. The circulation of precious objects mirrored the circulation of influence, creating networks of obligation and memory. Diplomatic letters from An to Hattusa shed light on the practicalities of international relations, including the exchange of hostages, the terms of tribute, and the negotiation of borders. These documents often contain personal touches, requests for medical help, complaints about treatment, and reassurances of friendship that humanized ancient politics. Reading them is like overhearing conversations across centuries, revealing both the universality and the specificity of statecraft. The Hittite military calendar took account of harvest seasons and weather, determining when troops could be mobilized without crippling the economy. Campaigns were planned to coincide with times when supplies were secure and routes passable, and logistics were handled with an eye toward endurance over flash. This attention to sustainability allowed Hittite forces to maintain presence in contested regions for extended periods. Certain kings of Hattusa undertook ambitious building programs that transformed the city's skyline with new gates, palaces, and temples. These projects provided work, displayed royal largesse, and created monuments intended to last beyond a single reign. Funding and organizing such works required sophisticated taxation, labor organization, and supply chains, showcasing the state's administrative competence. The Hittite legal corpus contains interesting provisions for social welfare, including regulations on the care of widows and orphans in certain contexts, reflecting a concern for social continuity. While hierarchical and patriarchal in many respects, Hittite law also acknowledged responsibilities that rulers and families owed to more vulnerable members of society. Such measures helped to maintain a social cohesion necessary for a functioning polity. Agricultural innovation, including terracing and irrigation practices, improved yields and allowed the state to support larger urban populations. Farmers experimented with crop rotations and animal husbandry techniques that increased productivity and reduced vulnerability to famine. The state sometimes intervened with seed distribution or emergency grain relief, linking agrarian stability to political stability. Festivals and public ceremonies created rhythms of shared experience that reinforced communal bonds and legitimized elite authority. People gathered to witness sacrifices, theatrical retellings of myths, and processions that publicly enacted cosmic order. Participation in these collective events bound diverse populations into a recognizable civic community centered on Hattusa. Hattusa's decline did not come all at once. It was a process influenced by internal strains and external pressures that included economic disruption and the movement of peoples. Some regions slipped from central control as local rulers asserted autonomy or succumbed to new powers, and trade networks realigned in response to shifting political maps. Those changes eroded the institutional integrity that had underpinned the Golden Era, and the city that had once dominated the landscape slowly lost its primacy. Even as Hattusa's political power waned, its cultural and legal innovations continued to ripple across the Near East, influencing successor states and later traditions. The practical wisdom found in Hittite law, diplomacy, and ritual found echoes in treaties and customs that followed, preserving elements of their approach to governance. Archaeology and philology revived Hattusa's voice in modern times, reminding us that even vanished capitals leave enduring legacies. The royal cemeteries and burial practices of the Hittites provide glimpses into beliefs about death and afterlife, showing both continuity with older Anatolian customs and unique adaptations. Tomb goods, funerary offerings, and burial architecture reveal how elites imagined their passage beyond life and how they sought continuity through ritualized remembrance. These practices also served political ends, asserting familial prestige and reclaiming ancestral legitimacy. In the end, Hattusa's Golden Era can be read as an experiment in combining militarized expansion with legal innovation and ritual legitimacy. Its rulers wielded force and words with equal skill, understanding that conquest alone cannot secure a realm without administration, law, and shared belief. The city stands as an example of how human societies build complex institutions to manage scale, diversity, and ambition. Listening to the long echo of Hattusa, we hear not merely the sounds of war or the clinking of craftsmen's tools, but a deeper conversation about how to order human life. The tablets and stones left behind form a chorus that testifies to intricacy, to the pains and ingenuity of governance, and to the cultural creativity that emerges when peoples interact. Hattusa's golden era thus remains an instructive and haunting chapter in the broader story of how civilizations craft their worlds. The story begins with two great civilizations waking at opposite edges of the Bronze Age world, each sharp and self-possessed in its own language and landscape. One rose on the broad Anatolian plateau, carved from limestone and oak, where kings wrote in a language that startled later scholars by being an older cousin of Greek and Latin. The other unrolled along the life-giving ribbon of the Nile, where pharaohs sculpted eternity in stone and spoke to their people in a script of pictures that guarded secrets of kingship and flood. These were the Hittites and the Egyptians, neighbors separated by geography but bound by trade routes, shared enemies, and an appetite for diplomatic theater that would culminate in a rivalry as public as any modern headline. As you imagine them, picture Hattusa perched among wind-scoured hills, its walls ringed with cyclopean stones and gateways named for gods and kings. Picture Thebes, Karnak, and the long avenues lined with sphinxes, where priests shuffled and incense smoke braided with the Nile's humidity. The two capitals kept different calendars and cultivated different gods, but each king dreamt the same imperial dream: to expand, to secure, to be remembered. That shared ambition turned trade and tribute into friction, and friction into conflict when resources or pride were at stake. Trade first brought them into repeated contact. Raw materials traveled in slow caravans. Tin and copper flowed toward the smiths who fed a chariot-dependent military, while timber, precious metals, and ivory moved the other way toward palaces that wanted to shine. Markets made them more aware of each other's strengths and weaknesses. Craftsmen copied techniques seen in imported goods, and royal gifts functioned like charged messages, meant to flatter or to warn depending on their delicacy. Diplomacy thus became an art form. Kings exchanged letters written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the age, and those letters were studded with ceremonial language about brotherhood, gifts, and mutual support. Treaties read like scripts of honor, rehearsed in stone and clay. The very act of translating feelings of enmity or alliance into cuneiform or hieroglyph elevated daily politics to the level of literature and ritual. And yet, in tone and temperament, the Hittite and Egyptian courts could not have been more different. Hittite kings moved among a loose oligarchy of noble families and warlords, negotiating with counselors who commanded loyalty through land and spear. Egyptian pharaohs presented themselves as divine intermediaries, embodiments of Ma'at whose decrees folded into theocracies and temple economies. Those different political fabrics meant that decisions about war and peace arose from distinct pressures and rhythms. A military revolution connected them, the chariot. Small, fast, and terrifying in its initial use, the chariot changed how battles were fought across the ancient Near East. Hittites and Egyptians both made chariots central to power, but they used them differently. Egyptian chariots were lighter and built to maneuver with speed, while many Hittite chariots carried additional passengers and armor, optimized for shock and weight in the crush of battle. The difference in chariot design reflected broader strategic preferences. Egyptians prized mobility, archery, and precise maneuvers. They loved the spectacle of a pharaoh standing in his chariot, bow drawn, a living image carved onto temple walls. Hittites relied on combined arms, chariots to break lines, infantry to hold ground, and the occasional siege engine to batter fortifications. Both learned from each other. Technology and tactics flowed back and forth as the battlefield became a laboratory. Within this military theater, the stage for the famous clash settled in Syria, a land mosaic of city-states, trade corridors, and strategic crossroads. Control over Syria meant access to resources, ports, and the ability to influence vassals who could tilt regional balances. For centuries, Egypt had seen the Levant as its sphere of influence, a buffer zone that protected its northern borders and ensures supplies of timber and trinkets. For Hittite rulers, Syria was a bridge to wealth, prestige, and an extension of power toward the Mediterranean. Acts of escalation blurred with the personal. Kings often claimed divine sanction for conquest, and their inscriptions turned defeats and retreats into palimpsests of glory. A king's narrative mattered: how he described a siege, how he styled an enemy, how he arranged bronze reliefs or clay tablets affected the attitudes of allies and subjects. When news of skirmishes traveled, it became the stuff of propaganda. A victory recorded in a temple relief was louder than any messenger could be on the road. The names around which this drama coalesced are vivid in surviving records. Suppiluliuma I stands as a Hittite titan, a king who transformed his realm by seizing opportunity, defeating rivals, and even arranging diplomatic marriages that rewrote regional loyalties. He reached into Syria and the eastern Mediterranean, challenging established powers and making the Hittites a force to be reckoned with. On the Egyptian side, rulers such as Thutmose III had earlier pressed northwards with sweeping campaigns, but it was Ramesses II who would come to be associated in memory with the quintessential clash at Kadesh. Kadesh itself was an ancient city offering a compact and loaded symbol, walls that had changed hands, and a riverside position on the Orontes that made it strategically invaluable. Armies converged there out of design, not mere happenstance. The campaigns around Kadesh were choreographed across seasons, with supply lines and scouting parties dictating the tempo of conflict. Soldiers in bronze armor, horses snorting, chariots clattering, these were the actors in a drama whose scripts were written in stone and clay. The clash at Kadesh in the late 13th century BCE is the best-known confrontation, and yet it resists simple summaries. Egyptian temples present a lavish, cinematic version. Ramesses II stands in his chariot before the reader, the river gleaming behind him, the battlefield a spread of enemies broken before his might. The reality likely involved miscommunication, tactical missteps, and near disaster for the Egyptians. The great battle degenerated into counterattacks, tactical withdrawals, and the sort of messy ambushes historians often find in the field. Still, it is the Egyptian portrayal, magnified by monumental reliefs and poetic retellings, that became the legend. Hittite accounts, preserved in Hittite records rather than on temple walls, cast the meeting in different hues. Hittite kings and scribes emphasized the resilience of their alliances, the cleverness of their troop deployments, and the containment of Egyptian ambitions. Neither side could offer a definitive, unvarnished truth. Each narrative served contemporary purposes, legitimizing rule, shoring up loyalty, and intimidating rivals. For listeners 1,000 years on, the two versions are companion pieces that sketch both the brutality and the theater of late Bronze Age warfare. Yet the battle's fame owes as much to diplomacy as to the clash of spears. Less than 2 decades after the fighting, a different instrument rose: the peace treaty. Historians celebrate the Ramesside-Hittite peace as one of the earliest formalized treaties in recorded history, a document that addressed mutual boundaries, extradition of fugitives, and clauses promising mutual aid. The agreement was not simply a ceasefire, it institutionalized a framework for coexistence, binding two etched-in-stone civilizations in a pact of reciprocal obligation. The treaty's language is arresting in its tone of pragmatic hospitality. It invokes gods on both sides to witness the covenants, declares reciprocal protection, and even frames the agreement as a restoration of natural order. The Hittite version survives in Akkadian cuneiform tablets, while Egyptian copies appear in hieroglyphic inscriptions, each a mirror of the other's public face. That mirroring suggests a growing recognition that perpetual war was costly, and that formal diplomacy could yield stability and advantages without bloodletting. The personal dimension of that treaty becomes particularly human when you think of the marriage alliance that followed, a Hittite princess journeying to the Egyptian court to become a royal consort of Ramesses II. The image of a foreign princess descending the Nile's banks, draped in silk or linen and accompanied by gifts and interpreters, offers a counterpoint to chariot charges and sacked towns. Marriage as diplomacy transformed hostility into kinship, and kinship into a brake on open conflict. To understand the Hittites more fully, it's worth pausing on what made them distinct among ancient powers. They were innovative administrators who built an empire not simply by conquest but by integrating conquered peoples through vassalage, treaties, and a complex legal code. Hattus's archives suggest a bureaucracy that managed land grants, religious cult lands, and military obligations with surprising sophistication. Kingship there balanced personal charisma with institutional checks, nobles held sway, and royal power often required negotiation. Religion was woven into governance. The Hittite king was the foremost servant of gods such as Teshub, the storm god, and embodied roles in ritual and sacrifice that blessed foreign campaigns as divinely sanctioned. But Hittite religion was eclectic. When they ruled over Syrians, Hurrians, and other groups, their pantheon absorbed gods and rituals from those cultures. Temples became crossroads of cultural exchange, where gods were named in multiple tongues and rituals adapted to bind newly incorporated peoples to the state. The Hittite legal tradition, preserved in tablets, shows a pragmatic temper. Laws provided for restitution, defined familial obligations, and regulated property. Punishments tended to aim at balancing injury with compensation rather than dramatic public execution for every crime. The system sought order and predictable outcomes. In this way, law helped sustain an empire with many different peoples under its umbrella, creating expectations of justice that stabilized daily life. Art and material culture tell another story of interchange. Hittite reliefs sometimes show an impersonal, forceful style, lion hunts and ritual scenes carved on stone, but clay seals, pottery, and metalwork reveal contacts with the Levant and Mesopotamia. Their kilns produced goods that were exported and imitated, and artistic motifs were borrowed and adapted. In those motifs lie traces of trade routes, mercantile networks, and the daily movements of artisans and soldiers alike. Language matters too. The Hittite tongue preserved on clay tablets, written in cuneiform borrowed from Mesopotamian scribes, was an early branch of the Indo-European family. This linguistic fact altered modern understandings of Indo-European dispersal. For listeners, the idea that the Hittites spoke a language related to Latin reminds us that the ancient world was not sealed into isolated cultures but part of a dynamic web whose threads reached across mountains and seas. Egyptian civilization, by contrast, anchored itself in a millennia-long rhythm of Nile flood and harvest, producing an administrative power that was both centralized and fed by temple economies. Pharaohs claimed divine lineage, and religion saturated every official act. Temples were both spiritual centers and economic engines, controlling land, labor, and grain. That concentration of symbolic and material power allowed Egypt to project its will across long distances when it chose to do so. Egyptian art and record-keeping provide the most luminous visual account of the conflicts. The colossal reliefs show Ramesses II in heroic scale, smiting foes with a god's eye precision. Those images were not mere propaganda, they were ritual acts, inscriptions meant to channel the power of the king across time. Temples served as screens where victory, divine favor, and royal legitimacy were replayed for centuries of pilgrims and priests. Yet Egypt was not monolithic in policy. The new kingdom pharaohs ranged from expansionists seeking to secure trade routes and resources to more cautious rulers who preferred diplomacy and marriage alliances. Their chief instrument of foreign policy alternated between military campaign and negotiated influence. The Egyptians often relied on long-standing client relationships in the Levant and a network of vassal city-states whose loyalty could be bought with gifts or enforced with armies. The Hittite rise challenged that order. As Hittite kings inserted themselves into Syrian politics, city lords faced a choice: to accept Hittite overlordship, to ally with Egypt, or to try to play the two powers against each other. That unpredictability magnified tensions. Each defection was a potential casus belli. Regional alliances formed and reformed like wind-driven dust devils, and larger empires fielded military forces that were always slightly mismatched against the landscape of mutual suspicion. This political complexity had a human rhythm to it. Envoys traveled over rough roads, weary but purposeful, bearing gifts, letters, and sometimes threats. Delegations lived in palaces for weeks, negotiating table manners and diplomatic niceties that could mean the difference between peace and invasion. The logistics of moving food, fodder, and men were as decisive as battlefield genius. Campaigns could falter for want of grain or a single misrouted supply wagon. The campaigns themselves were seasonal events. Armies moved in the dry seasons when rivers were lower and roads more passable. Winter campaigns were rare and costly. Both sides timed their maneuvers to harvest cycles, religious festivals, and the need to synchronize a disparate army made of tribal contingents and mercenaries. Commanders had to account for weather, local allegiances, and the intelligence gleaned from scouts and spies. Intelligence mattered more than glamour. Scouts reported the positions of enemy camps and the state of bridges and fords, and spies infiltrated cities to collect gossip about troop movements. The ancient world was not lacking in deception. False letters, planted rumors, and sudden night marches could reverse a campaign's momentum. It is telling that both Hittite and Egyptian records emphasize surprise attacks and betrayal as much as they celebrate heroism. Artillery in the ancient sense took forms different from modern expectations. Siegecraft involved ramps, battering rams, and prolonged starvation or blockade rather than explosive bombardment. Fortifications like those surrounding Kadesh were designed to delay attackers until reinforcements could appear. An army that lacked engineers or patience risked failure. The possession of skilled craftsmen and siege materials was thus strategic capital. Economics underpinned all of this. The Bronze Age required tin and copper for tools and weapons, and control of mines or trade routes conferred real military consequences. Merchants acted as vectors for both goods and political information. When trade routes were threatened, merchants lobbied kings for protection, and an abandoned caravan trail could signify broader geopolitical retreat. Cultural exchange was a subtler currency. Fashion, culinary tastes, religious motifs, and craft techniques migrated along the same routes that moved soldiers. Hittite banquets incorporated Levantine delicacies. Egyptian craftsmen took on Anatolian motifs. Even military innovations, like improved chariot wheels or harnesses, spread down trade corridors, producing iterative changes in how armies fought. These exchanges blurred the lines between. The story of the Hittites begins in the interior of Anatolia, where plateaus and mountains gather weather and history like a tight cloak. They rose from a tapestry of cities and peoples, carving an empire not by sudden conquest alone but by a long conversation between diplomacy, law, and devotion. Their heartland was a place called Hutti, and from its capital, Hattusa, came a voice that would echo across the Bronze Age, a voice that spoke with thunder, scripture, and iron. To understand their power, we must listen to three persistent chords in their music: the gods who watched them, the laws that bound them, and the quieter energies of administration, trade, and ritual that sustained them between battles. When we speak of Hittite gods, we do not mean a single heavenly assembly that neatly mirrors the Greek pantheon. The Hittites gathered deities like travelers gather spices, welcoming older local gods, Hurrian figures from the southeast, and the great storm deity who would become the empire's star. The storm god was visible in every conflict and harvest, a figure of weather and authority who could be called to judge disputes or bless a siege. Beside him stood the sun goddess of Arena, a goddess of order and justice whose radiance provided not only light but legal weight. She was the living seal that many a Hittite oath invoked. This religious pluralism was practical as much as pious. As the Hittites extended their reach into Syria and along the Mediterranean, they encountered gods with different languages and rituals, and rather than erase them, they absorbed them into a cosmic cabinet of powers. A treaty might be sealed not only by the Hittite pantheon but also by the gods of a vassal city, each deity called as a guarantor of the promises contained in clay. In calling gods this way, Hittite kings bound people to rules through fear of divine retribution, and religious syncretism became a tool of imperial cohesion as much as an act of faith. The king of the Hittites was a singular figure, part warrior, part priest, part magistrate. He sat at the center of theocratic power, conducting rituals in which the fate of the land and the integrity of the law were indistinguishable. When he promised protection or levied tribute, his words were backed by rituals performed in stone sanctuaries and smoke-thick temples. When he punished, the gods were invoked to witness and endorse the sentence. This was not mere symbolism. In a world where written contracts depended on divine guarantees, the king's ability to perform proper rites was part of his political capital. Cuneiform tablets from Hattusa reveal a civilization with a clerical precision that might surprise the modern imagination. Scribes kept records of treaties, land grants, and legal disputes with an almost bureaucratic exactness, copying rituals and laws side by side. The archive was a repository of power, texts that could make an old promise newly enforceable and turn a forgotten covenant into a living rule. In the hands of those who read and wrote, clay tablets became a mesh of authority, a hidden architecture upon which imperial strength depended. The laws themselves are not crude lists of penalties but a code shaped by balance and negotiation. Hittite laws often aimed at restitution rather than only terror. Compensation and fines featured alongside physical punishments. The logic was pragmatism. Compensation restored social equilibrium, upheld family honor, and distributed responsibility in ways that kept the workforce and the economy functioning. Yet the threat of harsher measures, mutilation, enslavement, death, still underscored the presence of ultimate sovereignty when mediation failed. Family, property, and personal injury were mainstays of legal attention. Marriages were contracts as much as unions, and the consequences of adultery, abandonment, or betrayal were spelled out with an eye toward both punishment and restoration. Inheritance and adoption mattered for the continuity of households and cults, because families were not only economic units but caretakers of ancestral rights and temple obligations. A daughter or son could be a bridge between generations, and the law made sure that bridges did not collapse into feuds. Temple economy was a subtle artery of Hittite life. Temples owned land and livestock, received gifts, and supported priests who performed rituals that the state needed to function. Religious institutions were not separate from power, they were integrated into the land tenure system and often acted as custodians of both sacred and secular wealth. Because priests sometimes judged disputes and kept records, temples became nodes where faith and law braided together into everyday governance. Ritual was the grammar of Hittite authority. From large public ceremonies to secret household rites, rituals structured time and obligation. Some rituals were celebratory, renewing the bond between king, gods, and people. Others were forensic, meant to extract truth or appease offended deities. The famous formulae that survived in written form show a people for whom the spoken word, ritually performed, could alter reality, heal a field, consecrate a treaty, or remove a curse. Curses and blessings were technical instruments. To swear falsehood under the gaze of the gods was to invite cosmic disorder, and so legal formulae frequently closed with imprecations that called down specific punishments if promises were broken. These were not mere poetic flourishes. Treaties were often accompanied by long lists of gods, each invoked to make a contract unbreakable. To modern ears it may sound theatrical, but for ancient actors these invocations served a practical legal function by stacking spiritual consequences upon social obligations. The Hittites wrote law in a style that was pragmatic and scenario-based. Unlike later legal codes that aimed for systematic comprehensiveness, Hittite laws respond to specific circumstances. If a man does this, then that follows. The result is a body of statutes that reveal everyday life, accidents, thefts, divorce, inheritance disputes, rather than grand philosophies. Because the laws are episodic, they also give us glimpses into social norms, what was considered damaging, who could be complicit, and how communities repaired breaches. Justice was not the abstract metaphysics of philosophers but an active, communal process. Trials could involve arbitration by elders, royal intervention, or ritual tests where gods were asked to reveal the truth. Witnesses mattered, and oaths sworn by deities had weight that modern secular courts can find hard to fathom. The legal culture relied on a shared world of belief where divine retribution was as practical a deterrent as any guard or fine. The Hittites were master diplomats, and their treaties show both legal sophistication and political shrewdness. The treaty with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh is the most famous example, a document in which two great kings called upon a mixture of deities from both lands to guarantee peace. Such pacts were not just temporary pauses in violence, they were structured commitments that included clauses about extradition, asylum, and mutual aid. And they were often sealed with reciprocal hospitality and marriages. Power often hid behind paperwork in the Hittite world. Vassal treaties, land grant tablets, and official letters established obligations and expectations, creating a lattice of dependence across vast distances. Hittite power depended less on occupying every inch of conquered territory than on making allies and vassals reliably dependent through promises that the gods and the king upheld. Even when a military garrison was absent, the memory of a treaty and the fear of divine retribution could be enough to keep a border intact. Chariot warfare and ironworking get a lot of attention, and rightly so, but they were only visible edges of Hittite power. The real engine included horse breeding, road systems, and logistics that connected grain stores to armies and temples to palaces. The Hittite military was effective because it could mobilize resources quickly, move men and provisions over long distances, and sustain campaigns through organized supply lines. In this sense, the hidden power was administrative competence, the ability to make movement and maintenance routine. Language itself was a source of strength. Hittite, written in cuneiform adapted from Mesopotamia, was the earliest attested Indo-European tongue, and it preserved ancient features scholars later called laryngeals. Using cuneiform enabled the Hittites to tap into a wider bureaucratic tradition while bending the script to their own idioms. The existence of an educated scribal class meant that agreements, histories, and religious rites could be counted on to survive beyond any single ruler's memory. Hattusa offered a stage for the empire's rituals and a vault for its knowledge. The city's archaeological remains, staggering walls, a monumental gateway, inner sanctuaries of stone, speak to an architecture of power that communicated both grandeur and precision. Within those walls, thousands of tablets slept for millennia. only to reawaken in the 19th and 20th centuries and allow historians to reimagine a civilization that once seemed to the modern world a mere footnote in classical histories. When Hittite texts were deciphered, a surprising picture emerged: an empire that was both militarily capable and legally sophisticated, a place where old cults and foreign myths lived under the same sky. The Hurrian myths preserved in Hittite copies, for instance, reveal a literary exchange where gods like Kumarbi and myths of succession intersect with local storm god narratives. This cross-cultural mythography reflected a political reality in which the Hittite state absorbed and repurposed stories to explain and legitimize its order. The law codes include unexpected measures that show a nuanced social ethic. They address the treatment of foundlings, the responsibilities of employers, and the rights of tenants. A runaway slave might be granted protection in some circumstances. A breach of contract might require quantitative compensation rather than simple retribution. These nuances suggest a legal imagination that sought to preserve labor and social coherence, not just to punish for punishment's sake. Women in Hittite society occupied varied roles, and the laws reflect that complexity. Some women wielded significant religious or administrative power, owning property and managing estates. Others lived under stricter patriarchal constraints. Royal women sometimes acted as political brokers through marriages and cult leadership, and priestesses could command respect and resources. The law addressed adultery, inheritance, and marriage with an eye toward both social stability and the protection of family rights. Children and family structures were central because they were the guarantors of continuity, of names, property, and cultic duties. Adoption was a legally recognized route to secure descendants when biological heirs were absent, and such adoptions carried obligations of care and inheritance. Whatever the household, the law sought to prevent the kind of fragmentation that would undermine temple offerings and labor organization, demonstrating how intimately private life connected to public stability. Violence was regulated in surprising ways. In many cases, property damage or personal injury led to monetary recompense rather than automatic execution. This approach had practical benefits. It kept artisans, farmers, and laborers in the community, allowed for reconciliation, and avoided the social disruption that wholesale execution might cause. Of course, for crimes seen as threatening the social order, sedition, treason, certain ritual offenses, the penalties could be severe and public. Public rituals sometimes functioned as legal theater. A king might perform rites to purify the land after a murder or to expiate a king's oath. These performances were not decorative extras but essential procedures in which social tension was symbolically resolved. When a god's anger was invoked over a crime, the restoration of peace required not just payment but a ritual realignment of the social cosmos. This was politics in sacramental clothing. One of the most striking examples of law and religion intertwining is the role of oaths in diplomacy. When a vassal promised allegiance, or when two powers agreed to a border, the gods were summoned to witness and punish breaches. To break such a vow was to risk the wrath of deities who might strike at crops, animals, or children. The specter of divine punishment functioned as a cost-benefit mechanism that often made a treaty more binding than any number of soldiers could. Hittite ritual manuals that survive in clay teach us how exacting and complex these ceremonies could be. The texts include lists of offerings, precise invocations, and directions for gestures and sequence, showing a ritual craft that required schooling and memory. These manuals ensured that rites could be repeated in the same manner from generation to generation, thereby guaranteeing continuity even as kings changed. Ritual knowledge became a form of institutional memory that kept the state's heart beating. A king's legitimacy often depended less on conquest than on proper ritual performance. A ruler who mismanaged cultic duties might find his authority eroding, while a king who presided over rites with care could stabilize troubled regions. This made the relationship between temple and throne a political calculus: support religious institutions that uphold the necessary rites, and you sustain your rule; neglect them, and you invite divine or human reproach. The Hittite pantheon shows an almost bureaucratic multiplicity, with certain gods assigned to specific functions: storms, the sun, fertility, war, and fate, but also with many localized deities who guarded households and fields. The state did not suppress these local powers; instead it created rituals that incorporated them into the broader cosmic order. By giving local gods a place within imperial ceremonies, the Hittites turned potential sources of fragmentation into instruments of unity. Magic and healing have a presence in the texts that is immediate and often moving. Rituals to avert disease or to remove curses were part of daily life, and the experts who performed them, exorcists, healers, and incantation specialists, held a kind of practical authority. Their work overlapped with legal practice when they swore to reveal hidden truths or when their curers restored someone to their social role. Magic, in this sense, was not superstition but a functional technology of social repair. The Hittite approach to foreign policy balanced force with law and treaties with tribute. The empire's southern reaches in Syria were managed through a network of vassal kings who retained a degree of autonomy while paying a price for imperial protection. This system was delicate. A heavy hand could provoke rebellion, while too much leniency could allow independence. Hittite rulers, therefore, often preferred negotiated settlements, marriages, and symbolic submissions over prolonged occupation. Trade routes contributed more than gold; they carried ideas, gods, scripts, and legal forms. Anatolian tin and silver, Syrian timber, and Mediterranean ports connected the Hittites to a commercial web in which social obligations and legal contacts mattered as much as cargo. The administration's capacity to regulate trade, collect tolls, and issue safeconducts made commerce a tool of cohesion. Merchants and caravans bore the empire's influence into distant markets, where tablet-based contracts and ritual protections helped secure fortunes. The Hittites were not imperial monoliths but composites of peoples and systems. Their armies included contingents and allies; their gods were a chorus of local divinities. This pluralism was a strength when managed well, because it allowed the empire to absorb diversity rather than fight it. But it was also a potential fault line. When administrative coherence weakened or external shocks occurred, the multi-ethnic fabric could fray. Archaeology has filled many gaps in our knowledge yet revealed new mysteries. Hattus's ruins, its sacral precincts, royal quarters, and the rock sanctuary at Yazilikaya offer tangible proof of ritual grandeur. The stone carvings and reliefs, however fragmentary, testify to a world where kings and gods negotiated meaning in visible form. Excavators also uncovered thousands of texts that unlocked the legal and ritual imagination of a people who had once seemed mute under the weight of time. The myths preserved in Hittite copies reveal themes of succession, divine conflict, and cosmic disorder that resonate with the laws and the political anxieties of rulers. In some tales, cosmic fractures follow from violated oaths or broken sacred objects, and restoration depends on recitation, sacrifice, or the cleverness of a god. These stories were not mere entertainment; they were cognitive maps that helped people understand why the world sometimes went awry and how order might be restored. The Hittites handled war with a mentality that blended theology and strategy. Before a campaign, rituals sought divine favor. During a siege, specialists tended to the soldiers and invoked gods for protection. After battles, offerings and purification helped reintegrate survivors into a settled life. This sacral framing of war meant that victory was not merely military success but an affirmation of divine sanction. Even the defeated could be ritually rehabilitated or ritually punished to restore balance. Iron gradually transformed warfare and craft, and the Hittites were among the early adopters of its use, which gave them technological advantages in weapons and tools. Metallurgy required sources of ore, skilled smiths, and an administrative ability to distribute finished goods, connecting metalwork to the broader picture of state capacity. The image of the Hittite sword or chariot evokes not only a weapon but a chain of economic and social processes that sustained the military machine. Hittite law and ritual also touched on environmental concerns in ways that speak to their agrarian reality. Laws concerning the damage to fields, the theft of crops, or the rights to water reveal an economy dependent on predictable seasons and shared infrastructure. Sanctuaries often commanded fields and meadows whose productivity supported cultic life, and hence managing land was as much religious stewardship as economic regulation. In some laws, deliberate acts against the community, like tampering with grain stores or damaging communal tools, drew severe responses because they threatened collective survival. The legal code thus encoded the imperative of cooperation in a world where famine and drought were existential threats. Punishments and compensations were calibrated not just to redress individual harm but to deter acts that could destabilize communal life. The rediscovery of the Hittites in the 19th and 20th centuries changed our understanding of the ancient Near East dramatically. Where once the Hittites were a shadowy mention in Greek and biblical texts, archaeologists unearthed a civilization full of its own documents and complexities. Decipherment of Hittite cuneiform revealed languages, treaties, and laws that demanded historians rethink the maps of power during the Bronze Age. Scholars have argued that the Hittite legal approach influenced and reflected broader Bronze Age legal practices across the region. While each culture had its idioms, the shared emphasis on oaths, divine witnesses, and compensation points to a common legal horizon. Hittite law thus becomes both a local record and a window onto an ancient legal consciousness in which religion and law were inseparable. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age left the Hittite world fractured, and the end of the empire is a complex puzzle. Palaces burned, archives ceased to be updated, and new powers emerged in the vacuum. However, the cultural habits of law and ritual did not disappear overnight. They diffused into successor states, local customs, and the religious imaginations of peoples who inherited parts of the Hittite legacy. Even in decline, the Hittite legal and religious systems left durable marks. Local laws, regional rituals, and certain administrative practices survived in reduced forms and informed later Iron Age polities. The memory of Hittite treaties and the legal weight of divine oaths persisted in diplomatic habits, illustrating how institutional practices can outlast the political entities that birthed them. The role of scribes in this continuity is understated but crucial. Scribes trained in the Hittite schools and versed in cuneiform could migrate, teach, and transplant legal and ritual formulas into new contexts. Their training was like a portable civilization, carrying tablets of law and prayer into new courts and causing the old divine invocations to echo in fresh halls. In that sense, the hidden power of the Hittites survived through literacy and the slow work of replication. Music, cultic song, and liturgy were other subtle canals of influence. Hymns inscribed on tablets not only preserved liturgical content but carried rhythm and memory across generations. These compositions reinforced doctrines of kingship and law by embedding them in melodies and recitations that could be performed in royal courts and village sanctuaries alike. The auditory continuity of ritual thus became a vehicle for social cohesion. Hittite law's attention to practical remedies speaks to an ethic of repair. When a person was wronged, the aim was often to restore their position materially and socially rather than only to exact vengeance. This restorative impulse can be read as a political technology. Societies that could repair harm were less likely to fragment into cycles of blood revenge, and therefore more capable of sustaining large polities. Law thus acted as a lubricant for social scale. The interplay between the localized cult and the imperial pantheon gave the Hittites a flexible theology. A farmer might worship a household deity in the morning and invoke a cosmic storm god by evening. A magistrate might call upon the sun goddess of Arena when swearing judgment. This fluidity allowed people to navigate personal obligations and state demands without cognitive dissonance, for the Hittite cosmos made room for many centers of loyalty. Legal inscriptions exhibit a concern for the future in ways that are almost modern. Land grants to officials, with clauses ensuring their inheritable status, created stable expectations and tied administrators to the crown. These grants were often accompanied by stipulations that the recipient continue to perform certain rituals, linking economic reward to religious duty. The fusion of property and piety thus incentivized long-term loyalty and practical governance. The Hittite approach to exile and asylum reveals an ethic of conditional mercy. Those who fled to temple precincts or who sought refuge at a king's court could sometimes find protection, but such clemency was rarely unconditional. Legal protocols governed the acceptance of refugees and the adjudication of their claims, reflecting a state that recognized the strategic value of mercy when balanced by control. We can also glimpse the Hittites' daily soundscape: hammers on bronze, the creak of chariot wheels, ritual drums, and the murmur of priests reciting formulas in tablet-rich rooms. These sounds, functional and ceremonial, are the oral backdrop against which law and religion operated, reminding us that ancient power was embodied in senses and routines, not just in decrees. The world of the Hittites was alive with repetitive acts that made order believable and habitual. One cannot overlook the role of literacy in legitimizing power. Reading and writing were skills restricted to an elite but portable enough to standardize practices across distances. When a treaty was copied and sealed, when a ritual manual was transmitted to a provincial temple, the written word stabilized expectations and made memory less dependent on human fallibility. In the long arc of empire, the clipboard mattered as much as the sword. Hittite kings cultivated personal images that combined martial manliness with ritual competency. Royal inscriptions celebrate military triumphs but also emphasize the king's role in ritual and law. This dual self-presentation served to reassure subjects that their sovereign could both protect them and keep the gods appeased. Authority in such a context was measured by success on the battlefield and by fidelity at the altar. Courts were theatrical enough to be persuasive. Lawsuits could involve public admonition, presentation of witnesses, and ritual acts to confirm testimony. The performative dimension of adjudication made law visible as a social act rather than a private negotiation. In this way, legal proceedings reinforced communal values and demonstrated that justice was not a secret in which only winners participated but a shared experience. The Hittites prized precedent and memory, which is why archives mattered so much. Royal decrees, prior decisions, and recorded rituals became sources for later judgment. Legal memory prevented erratic rulings and allowed administrators to act with continuity. Clay tablets functioned as the state's memory palaces, preserving the text of earlier settlements and providing templates for future governance. Religious festivals were seasons in which civic and ritual life merged into communal affirmation. Feasts, games, and cultic dramas tightened social bonds and reiterated legal norms through embodied practice. In gathering en masse, citizens reaffirmed their mutual obligations. In repeating ritual scripts, they reinforced the legal vocabulary that structured everyday behavior. Festivals thus became nodes where law and piety were rehearsed in public. The Hittites negotiated identity through law and ritual as much as through arms. Being Hittite meant participating in a legal culture that attached meaning to oaths and paying homage to a constellation of gods who guaranteed order. The empire's ability to make belonging an enacted ritual, through treaty, rite, and law, was a form of soft power that bound diverse peoples into a common physiology of loyalty. We should remember that law was often a bargaining tool as well as a punitive instrument. In disputes, compromises were common, and settlements reflected negotiated balances rather than unilateral decrees. This legal flexibility was both a product of and a reason for political stability. By allowing parties to save face and compensate, laws reduced the likelihood of long-term resentments that could fuel rebellion. The Hittite state's investment in monumental architecture was both practical and symbolic. Temples and gates announced permanence and order, while storage rooms and granaries supported the logistics of both the military and the festival year. Monumentality thus told a story about stability, and that story mattered when rulers sought to persuade subjects that their order was enduring and divinely preferred. Religion, law, and administration combined to produce a political technology of maintenance. The empire was less a congealed mass than an ongoing project of maintenance, rituals to reaffirm bonds, laws to repair breaches, and administration to keep resources flowing. The real hidden power lay in the capacity to make this maintenance routine and reliable across generations and changing leadership. This maintenance required people who could remember, perform, and adjudicate, the scribes, priests, judges, and local officials who kept the gears turning. Their labor was often anonymous but indispensable. Without their disciplined repetition of rituals and records, treaties would have been mere words and temples empty. These men and women embodied the quiet infrastructure of empire. Hittite law and ritual also had a performative pedagogy. Through repetition, communities learned what was permitted, what was taboo, and what was virtuous. Children who grew up hearing hymns and witnessing oaths internalized a moral grammar that then guided adult behavior. Law education was not formal for everyone, but cultural habituation ensured that norms were transmitted organically across generations. The secrets of Hittite resilience revealed themselves in the balancing acts they performed, between coercion and consent, between local autonomy and imperial oversight, between retribution and compensation. Each balance point was negotiated in courts and altars, marketplaces and palaces. These negotiations made the Hittite system adaptive and, for a long time, effective. Archaeological layers in Anatolia show periods of intense rebuilding and renovation, which suggests cycles of collapse and recovery rather than a single terminal decline. Even when political structures ruptured, the cultural substrates, ritual forms, legal memory, technical crafts, provided resources for new orders to emerge. The endurance of those substrates is the quieter story that often follows the headlines of wars and kings. The Hittites' legal imagination was also cosmopolitan in places. When they absorbed foreign elites, they often recognized local customs and incorporated them into imperial practice. This legal pluralism allowed the state to administer diverse populations without insisting on cultural homogeneity. Rather than impose a single legal code everywhere, the Hittites created layered expectations where local law and imperial prerogative coexisted. Looking at specific rituals, one sees a care for detail that borders on obsession: the number of cakes, the arrangement of animals, the direction in which priests faced. Such exactitude reveals a belief that the success of rituals, like the success of the state, depended on precision. Ritual manuals preserved not only the words to be spoken but the embodied choreography necessary to make those words efficacious. In the practice of law, evidence often mattered less than the framing of obligations. An oath could outweigh a constellation of circumstantial facts if it was properly witnessed and ritually sealed. The law valued solemn promise as a social commodity, and by protecting that commodity, the Hittites ensured transactions of all kinds. This emphasis on performative promise shaped how people negotiated everything from land sales to military alliances. The Hittite pantheon functioned as a legal core. Gods had roles, and priests performed them with the same administrative care as other officials. Gods could be petitioned, summoned as guarantors, or appeased after offenses, and priests mediated these interactions. The result was a highly institutionalized religiosity that operated parallel to and intertwined with secular authority. Finally, the legacy of the Hittites is as much a story of method as of monuments. Their use of the written word to bind promises, their skill at integrating diverse gods into legal frameworks, and their administrative attention to routine maintenance offer lessons about the stealthy forms of imperial power. The empire's outward triumphs are memorable, but it is the quieter arts of law, ritual, and record-keeping that explain how those triumphs were sustained across decades and generations. Long before our modern maps were drawn, when the world still smelled of oxide and incense, there rose a city with walls like a promise and gates that measured the ambitions of kings. Hattusa sat on a rocky plateau in the heart of Anatolia, a place where weather and stone conspired to produce both isolation and fortitude. People came to Hattusa not because it was convenient, but because it was commanding, a statement of permanence in a landscape that could be changeable and cruel. When I say Hattusa was commanding, I am not talking about a single building or one ruler's whim. I mean streets that wound against the wind, temples that caught the first light like bowls of fire, and granaries hewn of durable stone where the state folded its wealth into measured, patient stores. Citizens, foreigners, scribes, and soldiers all lived under the same sky, and their lives were braided together by law, ritual, and commerce. The Hittites themselves did not arrive fully formed, they emerged through centuries of movement and adaptation. Their roots spread into Anatolia from the north and east, meeting older peoples, absorbing languages and customs, and reshaping them into something distinct. By the second millennium before our era, they had gathered into a political force capable of challenging Egypt and Babylon, and Hattusa became the beating heart of that rising power. You can imagine the city on a morning when drums of commerce began to thrum, traders from the Mediterranean coast, caravans loaded with copper and tin, potters bringing wares, and smiths whose work would supply both household and war. The rhythm of the city was not purely economic. Rituals punctuated the day, and the presence of temples meant that the gods were invoked as partners in both business and conflict. Every decision, from marriage to diplomacy, carried a religious undertow. At the pinnacle of Hittite might, kings like Hattusili and Tudhalia built palaces that were administrative hubs as much as royal residences. These buildings were centers where scribes gathered to record treaties, laws, and accounts in cuneiform that the Hittites adapted from older Mesopotamian models. The bureaucracy was pragmatic. Records were kept because the state needed them to manage grain, levy troops, and negotiate with neighbors. This is a civilization that thought in lists and ledgers as much as in glory. What set the Hittites apart, in many ways, was their flexibility. They blended Hurrian rites and Indo-European elements, and their elite could admire both the lyricism of foreign courts and the dry logic of Mesopotamian kingship. They were not insulated from their environment, rather they made compromise a virtue. When a treaty needed a clause, they borrowed a formula and adjusted it to local custom. When a god seemed distant, they invited him to the new pantheon and gave him a place at the table. Hattusa itself was a study in contrasts. The citadel was surrounded by rings of defensive walls, punctuated by towers and gateways with names as solemn as oaths. Beyond those fortifications lay neighborhoods where brick and timber made softer outlines, gardens, and orchards that suffered and thrived according to the season. The King's Gate, the Lion Gate, the Royal Road, each carried an image or story, and each marked a stage along daily life and ceremonial procession. The Hittite armies were another piece of this tapestry, and they deserve to be described accurately because they were both sophisticated and adaptable. Chariots slotted into their ranks as shock vehicles meant to break an enemy's line. Behind them came spearmen and archers, disciplined and trained. War was not only an expression of brute force, but also a negotiation of supply lines, loyalty, and timing, and the Hittites were adept at planning and provisioning campaigns. Diplomacy at Hattusa was an art, a filigreed conversation that used gifts, marriages, and documents to shape alliances. The famous treaty with Egypt's Ramesses II, concluded after the bloody and indecisive Battle of Kadesh, is a window into this world. It was an agreement that mixed the pragmatic and the ceremonial, an attempt to secure borders, recognize spheres of influence, and invoke gods who would punish oathbreakers. Hittite diplomats understood that the written word could become a weapon of its own kind. In the quiet hours of the royal scribal houses, clay tablets multiplied. Scribes drilled signs into wet clay, preserving decisions that would survive 1,000 summers underground. They wrote treaties, legal codes, letters that tugged at memory, and religious hymns that prayed for fertility and protection. Each tablet became a tether to the past, and centuries later these tethers would undo the assumption that Hittite history was lost. Yet no empire stands unchallenged forever, and beneath the surface of Hattusa's stone steadiness small fractures gathered force. Economies rise and fall with climate and trade, and people are always seeking advantages, whether by cunning or by brute. Internal dynamics, such as succession disputes and noble rivalries, could be as lethal to stability as foreign invasion. Power shared with many hands invites friction, and the Hittite throne was sometimes a seat of compromise rather than unquestioned authority. One of the pressures that Anatolian polities faced was the shifting pattern of trade. The Bronze Age economy depended on long-distance flows of metals, copper and tin for bronze, that moved along routes that could be rerouted or closed by war, piracy, or changing alliances. A disruption in these flows would not just mean fewer weapons, it meant fewer tools, fewer ornaments, and a decline in the specialized crafts that made cities like Hattusa vibrant. Economic change is a slow-acting poison, and when elites cannot maintain luxuries they used to count on, their authority can be undermined. Moreover, new groups pressed against old boundaries. The so-called Sea Peoples, a fragmentary term for maritime raiders and migrants, shook the eastern Mediterranean and the Levant in the later centuries of the Bronze Age. Their movements are still debated among scholars, but they represent a wider pattern of population mobilization and instability that made the region harder to govern. The Hittites were not isolated islands. They shared the same regional weather and tectonics of movement that affected all their neighbors. Famine and climate change are often invisible in the official annals, but they leave traces in settlement patterns, in the prayer lists of needy temples, and in grain inventories that show worrying declines. Recent studies of pollen and isotopes hint at drier, cooler spells and to episodes of crop failure in Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age. When scarcity becomes regular rather than episodic, the social contract phrase, soldier's desert, craftsmen leave for greener pastures, and the city's capacity for defense diminishes. The archaeology of Hattusa reveals these stresses in scarred layers. There are horizons of ash and collapse where rebuilding efforts seem hurried and haggard rather than monumental and grand. Buildings that once glittered with carved reliefs were abandoned or turned into rubble, and the careful stratigraphy shows that calamity came in pulses. Yet archaeologists caution against single-cause explanations. The fall of cities is rarely the result of one misfortune alone. Let us not forget that the Hittite state was also a network of vassal cities and client kings. Hattusa could command, cajole, and sometimes coerce, but its reach depended on loyalties that might be thinly held. In times of stress, provincial leaders could seize the moment to assert autonomy or to strike bargains with rival powers. When the center could no longer distribute the resources that sustained those loyalties, centrifugal forces gained strength. Cultural shifts also play a role. The religious imagination of the Hittites was syncretic, which made it resilient but also porous. New cults could be integrated, but when authority faltered, religious change could signal political reorientation. Shrines were both local and political, and control over sacred places meant more than spiritual prestige. It meant access to a community's identity and its willingness to support rulers who claimed divine favor. As pressures mounted, the royal household itself could be a source of vulnerability. Succession disputes, brothers claiming lineage, regents holding power for minor kings, and the elevation of military leaders into political actors created instability at the top. These internal dramas could be negotiated, but they often bleed into violence that weakens the state's ability to respond to external threats. A kingdom divided within cannot easily project power beyond its borders. At the same time, the Hittites continued to innovate militarily. They experimented with chariot tactics, fortified engineering, and logistical systems that allowed them to muster and move troops with remarkable efficiency for the age. Yet innovation must be sustained by economic support and social consensus. Without steady supply lines and loyalty, even the best military strategies falter. The armies that once spread Hittite influence could become ragged shadows if the state's infrastructure decayed. The final decades of Hattus's ascendancy were punctuated by a series of shocks that compounded upon one another. Some were dramatic: sieges, raids, and episodes where foreign mercenaries or migrating peoples carved out new spaces. Others were slow-moving: a reduction in trade revenue, a shrinking tax base, and a diminishing pool of skilled artisans. Together, these factors eroded the cushion that had once made Hattusa durable against the vagaries of history. There are moments in which the archaeological record seems almost to hold its breath: walls torn down, doors burned, art neglected. These are the moments that invite speculation about sudden catastrophe. Were the attackers from outside, or was there an internal conflagration, a palace coup that left ruins in its wake? The truth is rarely so neat, and the evidence at Hattusa suggests multiple episodes of violence and abandonment rather than a single cataclysmic night. When invading cohorts did reach Hattusa's gates, they found a city that had been through cycles of repair and neglect. Some gates show signs of hurried reinforcement, others display layers of fire. Items left behind in houses, the pottery, children's toys, personal seals, tell a human story of interruption, of lives paused amid the tangible routines of daily existence. These personal traces remind us that political collapse has human costs that reverberate through ordinary households. It is important to emphasize that the fall of Hattusa did not happen in isolation. Cities across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East were experiencing transformations during this period. Ugarit, Mycenaean centers, and even parts of Lebanon and Syria felt pressure. The collapse was regional, and networks that had connected distant provinces were frayed. In some cases, those networks never recovered in their former shape, and new centers of power rose from their ashes. The notion of the Sea Peoples as a single monolithic cause is tempting but unsatisfying. If we imagine armies flowing like a single wave, we lose sight of the myriad local conditions that allowed particular groups to move, to raid, or to settle. Some coastal raids might have been opportunistic attacks on weakened ports, others were migrations prompted by drought or social tension in distant lands. Hattusa's decline intersects with these larger migratory patterns, but it was also shaped by its own internal vulnerabilities. In the wake of abandonment, Hattusa's stone and clay did not vanish, they lay in the weather, telling a different story to each eye that studied them. Temples tumbled into silence and their ritual paraphernalia decayed into the earth, but the impressions left on clay tablets survived because they were buried and mineralized. It is through these small hardened records that modern listeners receive the voices of a world that otherwise would be distant and silent. Rediscovery in the modern era is a chapter worth recounting because it reshaped how scholars and the public imagined the Hittites. In the late 19th century, European excavators began to unearth the city's remains and to decipher fragments of its language. The process was slow and often contentious. Early interpretations were colored by the biases of the period. Still, as more tablets were read and more walls catalogued, a clearer picture emerged of a society that had been both sophisticated and strange to the modern eye. The decipherment of Hittite cuneiform in the 20th century was a breakthrough that altered historical narratives. Suddenly the Hittites could speak, and they spoke in administrative reports, royal proclamations, and diplomatic letters. We learned about their legal processes, their treaties, and the names of kings who had once seemed mere footnotes in a fragmentary chronicle. This textual revelation recentered Anatolia in ancient history, where it had been overshadowed by more famous powers like Egypt and Babylon. Archaeologists at Hattusa unearthed monuments carved with images of gods and beasts, reliefs that captured scenes of ritual and conquest, and a topography of sacred spaces that mapped out the city's religious geography. The Great Temple, the royal sanctuaries, and the carved portals show that Hattusa was more than a capital. It was a spiritual and administrative node that attracted pilgrims, officials, and supplicants. Pilgrims came to petition gods and to leave votive offerings, turning the city into a living register of popular devotion. The sensibilities of those who first excavated Hattusa are important to consider because they filtered what was found into particular narratives. Their choices of what to excavate, how to record structures, and which inscriptions to publish shaped the early corpus of Hittite knowledge. Later scholars revised many initial assumptions and expanded the frame through interdisciplinary work, combining archaeology with paleoclimatology, epigraphy, and even bioarchaeology to build a fuller account of the city's life and death. As more fragments of Hittite history came to light, the picture of the collapse grew nuanced. It became clear that Hattusa's decline had phases. There were times when the city contracted into a smaller footprint and reused earlier walls as emergency fortifications. There were intervals of rebuilding that suggested civic resilience, and then there were episodes of abandonment from which the city did not recover. This on-again, off-again pattern challenges the simple story of a single destructive event. Among the sources that speak most chillingly are letters written by officials who witnessed the unraveling. They speak of grain running low, of troops unable to muster, of refugees arriving with stories of attacks that have emptied towns. Those letters make collapse personal: a clerk who can no longer send provisions, a local commander who must make impossible choices. Their words stitch together an intimate atlas of anxiety. The archaeology of destruction, charred layers, collapsed roofs, and hurriedly buried valuables gives texture to those written complaints. We can see where a household burned and where a temple was looted, and we can match these sites to the chronological layers exposed in careful digs. In many cases, the material damage is uneven. Some districts were devastated while others were comparatively intact, suggesting a patchwork of conflict rather than an indiscriminate razing. One of the most resonant images is that of the city's defensive rings, once symbols of power, gradually losing their efficacy. Towers that had been matchmakers of iron and stone were undermanned or unrepaired, and gates that were meant to repel assailants became thresholds for desperate flight. Defensive architecture tells a story not only of past confidence but of what happens when resources will dry up. Neighboring powers watched and sometimes took advantage of Hattusa's weakness. The Assyrians, Hurrians, and various Anatolian principalities all recalculated their positions when the Hittite center faltered. Some expanded into vacuums left by retreating Hittite influence, others formed short-lived partnerships that dissolved with the next season of unrest. International politics did not stop for Hattusa's crisis. In fact, it intensified as new opportunities emerged. It is also worth turning to the human scale: artisans whose craft was tied to the court, families who maintained household shrines, and farmers who fed the city. When court patronage waned, artisans lost patrons and sometimes the specialized skills died out or migrated. Household religious practices changed in tempo and orientation, and farmers might abandon terraces that once contained olives or grapes when markets and protection evaporated. The social fabric frays most acutely at the household level, where everyday rhythms either support or collapse the larger political order. Another layer to consider is the role of trade partners who were themselves undergoing change. Egypt's focus shifted over time, and the Levantine cities were complicated by their own internal stories. Hattusa existed in a web, and when knots were cut elsewhere, the whole structure could wobble. This interconnectedness means that the fall of Hattusa must be read not only as a local tragedy but as part of a regional transformation of the late Bronze Age world. We should also think about the cultural memory that Hattusa left behind among successor communities. Even after the city was emptied, its ruins persisted on the landscape and shaped the identities of later inhabitants. People passing through the ruins carried stories of former grandeur, and in some places later rulers reused the stones of Hattusa for their own buildings, literally integrating the past into new projects. The palimpsest of stone and narrative ensured that Hattusa never faded entirely from the imagination of the region. Over the centuries, the technical skills of Hittite artisans, their musical forms, and certain ritual formulas diffused into the cultures that replaced or absorbed them. You can detect echoes in later Anatolian and Syrian practices, and in some legal concepts that reappear under new names. The loss of Hattusa was not total cultural annihilation, it was a transformation in which seeds scattered by the Hittites sprouted in different soils. As modern listeners, we gain perspective when we consider how contemporary methods uncover the past. Remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, and refined pottery analysis add layers of evidence beyond what early excavators could see. Even isotope analysis of human remains can indicate migration patterns and changes in diet, offering subtle but powerful clues about life at the margins of collapse. The ongoing technological toolkit allows scholars to refine the chronology and to ask new questions with more precise answers. Yet for all of these scientific advances, there remains an element of interpretation and, at times, competing narratives. Some scholars emphasize climate as the decisive factor, others highlight internal political failure or external attack. The truth is likely composite. Like any complex system, Hattusa's fall was the product of many weak links breaking at different times and in different places, until the cumulative effect proved fatal to the urban organism. What we can say with confidence is that the end of Hattusa was a process, not a single event. There were phases of contraction, adaptation, and attempted revival before the final abandonment. This stretching out of decline meant that contemporaries experienced loss and hope in quick succession. They counted on the next harvest, the next diplomatic success, the next repair, and sometimes those hopes were met, sometimes they were not. The repeated failures, however, built up a sense that the old order was slipping away. The image of Hattusa erased by flame and sword is dramatic, but it should not overshadow the quieter modes of dissolution, bureaucratic paralysis, the erosion of civic rituals, and the slow decline of specialized crafts. The loss of administrative coherence meant that tablets could no longer be produced and archived, and without records a centralized system becomes harder to sustain. Even the physical act of writing relies on social structures for training scribes and maintaining archives. When Hattusa's administrative heart stopped beating, the circulatory system of the state, its ability to move goods, information, and troops, began to fail. Roads became dangerous, and merchants sought safer routes or stopped moving certain goods altogether. This contraction in exchange networks meant not only fewer luxuries in the palace but fewer necessities in the households of commoners, who might suddenly find themselves worse off than their rulers who still enjoyed stored wealth. Once abandonment became widespread, rural populations reorganized around different centers. Smaller fortified sites gained prominence as people clustered into safer places with more limited resources. The urban life that once streamed through Hattusa's gates diminished in scale, and local forms of governance emerged that were less centralized but more immediately responsive. This socio-political reconfiguring allowed for forms of survival that were less glamorous than imperial rule but more stable in uncertain times. Hattusa's fall also taught future generations about resilience and reinvention. In some regions, new polities learned from the mistakes of the past and developed hybrid strategies to manage local autonomy and broader alliances. Others doubled down on military fortification, rerouting trade corridors, and inventing new administrative mechanisms. The Bronze Age collapse was not a single script, it composed multiple endings and subsequent beginnings. It is revealing to walk mentally through the ruins as the seasons change. In spring, the terraces would flush with green and the memory of abundance might briefly veil the absence of urban clientele. In summer, the intense sun would bake the clay and reveal the delicate outlines of once painted reliefs. In autumn, windstorms might expose new layers for archaeologists to find, while winter snows awaited the renewed work of excavation. The cycles of nature both reveal and conceal the past, and they remind us that human timelines are only one part of the long temporal fabric. There is a poignancy in the last recorded acts of Hattusa, tablets that end mid-sentence and administrative lists that trail off. These fragments read like interrupted conversations. When we reconstruct them, we are performing an act of recovery, breathing a semblance of the living voice back into names and measurements that had lain dormant for millennia. The metaphor of a city as a living being is not merely poetic, it helps us understand collapse as something that affects organs and systems differently. Hattusa's temples may have closed their doors as funds dried up, but a frayed market might limp on for years. The loss of ceremonial life and the decline of administrative precision often moved at different tempos, producing a staggered implosion rather than a single dramatic fall. The story of Hattusa invites us to confront the contingency of human systems. No matter how impressive a civilization's walls are, they are contingent in the sense that their endurance depends on complex and often fragile networks. The Hittites mastered certain arts of governance and war, but they could not immunize themselves against shifting trade, ecological change, or social fragmentation. This does not reduce their achievements, rather it makes them more human and, perhaps, more instructive. Archaeologists sometimes emphasize continuity amid collapse. Even as official institutions crumbled, local practices and domestic rituals lingered, seeding future cultural formations. This continuity suggests that the end of an imperial center is often the beginning of a different, subtler cultural transmission. Hittite names, myths, and technical knowledge persisted in new forms and influenced subsequent Anatolian and Syrian polities. As scholars piece together the late stages of Hattusa's life, they draw on complementary disciplines. Paleobotanists examine seed remnants to infer diets and agricultural shifts, while pollen analysis reconstructs broader environmental trends. Epigraphers read the blunt and sometimes anxious lines of administrative tablets. Each specialty adds a brushstroke to a complex painting, and the final image is composite, fragile, and full of nuance. We must be cautious about drawing moral lessons in an overly simplistic way. The fall of Hattusa is dramatic and rich in detail, but it is not a morality tale with a tidy conclusion. Instead, it offers a kaleidoscope of human reactions, ingenuity, denial, cooperation, treachery, and adaptation. These are timeless human responses to adversity and change, which is why the tale still resonates. What survives most strikingly are not always the monumental sculptures but the small everyday objects: a child's bowl, a door hinge, a fragment of a woven cloth that the soil preserved, in a manner of speaking. These artifacts are not glamorous, but they are the threads that reconstruct ordinary life. They reveal the textures of domesticity that outlasted political grandeur and which grounded people in recurrent routines even as empires rose and fell. The study of Hattusa also poses ethical questions about archaeological practice. Excavation can unearth history, but it also disturbs sites sacred to later communities and risks removing artifacts from their cultural context. Modern archaeologists are increasingly mindful of these responsibilities, working to involve local communities and to mitigate the removal of heritage. The story of Hattusa is thus not only ancient but contemporary, entwined with how we choose to remember and preserve the past. Listening to the story of Hattusa gives us a sense of scale that textbooks sometimes fail to convey. Here is a city that managed international diplomacy, ran a sophisticated administrative apparatus, and engaged in military innovation, yet it was still vulnerable to the slow accumulations of pressure. The city's rise and fall were not mere abstract political shifts. They were lived realities for tens of thousands of human beings who made choices and suffered consequences. One of the most arresting images is of the royal archive itself, sealed rooms where tablets were tucked away like Roman wax tablets placed in stands, protected perhaps with ritual as much as with practicality. Those archives outlived many aspects of the state because they were hidden and because their clay hardened into a durable record. This preservation allows us to hear official voices that resisted the erasure that fire, theft, and weather might have caused elsewhere. In considering the fall of Hattusa, it is tempting to prioritize dramatic episodes of war, but we must always return to the quieter systems that sustain societies. Food surpluses, civic rituals, the training of scribes, the loyalty of vassals, these are the understated currencies that maintain an empire. When they fray, the most formidable walls can be circumvented by neglect and social erosion. That said, we should not downplay the agency of neighboring powers who capitalized on Hattusa's weakness. As Hittite control receded, local lords negotiated new allegiances and sometimes joined forces with external actors. The geopolitical chessboard rearranged rapidly, and once remote territories suddenly became contested zones. The decline of a central authority often produces a scramble to reconfigure the political map. Another dimension is the psychological effect of repeated setbacks on a society's elite. If kings face a cycle of military failure and domestic insurrection, their authority and confidence erode. This psychological fatigue can be as pernicious as material shortages because it affects decision-making. Rulers may behave erratically or turn to desperate measures. The slow corrosion of confidence can thus be a hidden but powerful accelerant of decline. We can also find in the story of Hattusa a caution about the limits of military approaches that disregard social resilience. Armies can secure territory for a season, but without stable administration and economic foundations, gains are ephemeral. The Hittites were often effective militarily, yet their capacity to hold territory depended on more complex social arrangements that unraveled when tested by sustained strains. Hattusa's final abandonment is a potent image not because it erased the Hittite legacy but because it transformed it. Stones reused in later constructions, tablets moved as curiosities, and rituals adapted to new contexts show an afterlife that was messy and resourceful. The Hittite contribution to the cultural stock of the region persisted, diffused, and recombined in ways that historians and archaeologists still work to untangle. For listeners driving through modern landscapes far from Anatolia, there is a particular resonance in how ruins anchor memory to place. The stones of Hattusa do not speak in the same voice as they once did, but they still structure a narrative of human aspiration and fragility. To walk among those stones is to touch an archive of global significance, an archive of how societies negotiate power and loss. The fall of Hattusa therefore invites contemplation about the cycles that run through human history. Cities rise because people gather resources, share rituals, and develop trust. They fall when those bonds fray. Hattusa's story is one of ingenuity and fragility, of remarkable cultural synthesis and the slow accumulation of stresses that outpaced its capacity to adapt. It stands as both a warning and an elegy. Yet even as the city emptied and administrative voices fell silent, the landscape continued to host life. Farmers reworked terraces, shepherds moved flocks through familiar pastures, and the seasons kept turning. The human tale did not cease at the gates of Hattusa, it simply shifted forms and scales. New communities emerged from the rearranged map, carrying with them fragments of Hittite practice combined with innovations born of necessity. The rediscovery and excavation of Hattusa in modern times have also enriched our cultural imagination. Novelists, historians, and filmmakers have drawn on its ruins to tell stories about lost worlds, about diplomacy and war, about the intimacy of ruined houses and the bitter-end politics of collapsing empires. These creative engagements keep the memory of Hattusa alive for contemporary audiences, and they reflect a continuing fascination with civilizations that once shaped regional destinies. If there is a lesson in Hattusa's demise that remains relevant, it is perhaps the reminder that complexity can be a source of both strength and vulnerability. Systems that integrate many functions, economic, religious, military, are powerful precisely because they can coordinate those activities. But they are also vulnerable when one subsystem fails, because the whole system depends on its parts functioning in concert. Hattusa's fall therefore highlights the importance of adaptable governance and distributed resiliency. Reconstruction efforts, both in the archaeological sense and in the narrative sense, try to assemble a coherent story from shards and echoes. This process is inherently imperfect, shaped by the questions scholars ask and the methods they use. But the mosaic that emerges is a powerful reminder of human ingenuity. The Hittites built a complex polity that drew on a wide range of cultural resources and, for centuries, competed successfully with other great powers of the Bronze Age. As the listener contemplates these ruins from afar, it is worth remembering the humanity that animated them. Royal decrees, legal contracts, prayers, and love letters were all part of the same social web that ultimately frayed. These are not just artifacts of a vanished bureaucracy, they are traces of human concerns that echo into our own lives: the desire for security, the attempt to form lasting agreements, the fear of scarcity, and the hope that the next generation will do better. The story of Hattusa's end, then, is not simply a historical curiosity. It is a long and complicated tale about the conditions under which power sustains itself and the ways in which it dissolves. The city's fall was not an abrupt divine judgment but a slow accumulation of pressures that shifted the balance and revealed the fragility hidden beneath monumental facades. In that sense, the fall of Hattusa reads like a mirror held up to human societies in every age. Even the silence that followed Hattusa's abandonment is eloquent. Where once tablets were hammered into clay and filed in archives, now wind and rain took over the work of erasure, eroding edges and depositing layers of soil over what had been public memory. Nature and time conspired to cover the traces, and yet the city's story persisted in oral memory and in scattered artifacts. This persistence is a testimony to human attachment to place and story. We cannot end without paying attention to the contemporary significance of Hattusa. Its ruins, excavated with care, are a shared heritage that connects modern communities to layers of the past. Preservation is not a neutral act, it reflects choices about what stories we honor and how we engage with complex histories. The international collaboration that steadies Hattusa today is itself a bridge across time, a modern attempt to sustain a dialogue with a vanished political center. Finally, when you picture Hattusa at dusk, imagine the last lamps being snuffed in a palace corridor, the final shelves of tablets being locked away perhaps forever, and families assembling their few belongings for uncertain travel. Imagine a child pressing her hand against a cool stone column and not knowing that generations later researchers would read her name from a clay seal. These human moments give the archaeological record its heartbeat, and they make the fall of Hattusa not just an academic case, but a human story worth listening to at length. That child's hand on the stone could have been any of ours. Subscribe and write in the comments what touches you more, imagining that goodbye or knowing her name survived the centuries.